Apologetics webinar I run every Saturday. Here in the UK, British time is 8 p.m., which corresponds to 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, 12 noon Pacific. And every week we bring on different scholars, apologists, thinkers, experts from across the theological, philosophical spectrum to present to us on topics of interest to Christians. And then we open up to open floor Q&A, discussion, dialogue, and debate. And so we are interested in discussing the evidence for the Christian faith, and also cross-examining, evaluating, critiquing alternative worldviews such as Islam, Mormonism, etc. And so this week we are going to be discussing the Quran's many problems, giving a critique of Islam in the company of my friend Dr. J. Smith, who is an expert on the subject of Islam. He's going to be presenting to us for about an hour, and then we're going to be taking questions and discussion. There's a number of ways you can participate in today's live webinar. You can simply sit back, watch, listen, enjoy anonymously, or you can participate in the chat window. Please, if you're doing so, direct chat to everyone rather than just panelists. That would be great. You can also click the Q&A button at the top of your screen and submit a question in textual form, anonymously if you wish. And you can also click the raise hand button at the top of your screen, and at the appropriate time we'll promote you to be a co-panelist with our guest speaker, and you'll have opportunity to interact that way as well. So without further ado, let me turn over to our special guest speaker, Dr. Jay Smith. Jay, thanks for being with us. Do you want to maybe start by introducing yourself and then just launch into the topic? That would be awesome.
Terrific. Thanks, John. It's good to be here. We've done a few of these before, so this is not the first time. But this it'll be interesting because this material that we're going to introduce today will be new. Now, I have a PowerPoint. You can see that on your screens, and I'll be going through the PowerPoint for the first hour. Then we will open it up to questions. But in order for me to get through the PowerPoint, I will not be answering questions while I am actually doing the talk. We'll do that at the end, towards the end, once I finish the PowerPoint itself. So let's go right into it and let's get into this. Now, let me just say before I start, the Quran's many problems. There are many problems that are internal to the Quran, which I have talked about on other occasions and I will talk about in the future. I'm not talking about the internal problems with the Quran. I'm not talking about looking at the Quran, unpacking it, trying to find contradictions with it or historical anachronisms. That's for another talk for another day. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the historical problems with the Quran. This is the new material that's causing so much damage and that is creating a lot of havoc in scholarly circles. And that's the material that I'll be introducing today. So let's get into that and let's start with the PowerPoint itself. Now, Muslims have always claimed that the Quran is inimitable. They have always claimed that it is a revelation that is uncreated, which means it has always existed eternally on clay tablets in heaven. We get that in Surah 85, Ayah 22 from the Quran itself. So this is not something that we're claiming. These are the claims. And these are the four claims I want to get out right from the very beginning. They also claim that this Quran that is on these eternal tablets was sent down over a period of 22 years between 610 and 632 to a man named Muhammad, of course, in the early 7th century. Thirdly, that the Quran was finally completed, not during Muhammad's lifetime, but during the time of Uthman in its final form. So this Quran that I have in my hand here, this book right here, was completed in around 652, roughly 20 years after Muhammad's death during the reign of the third Caliph Uthman. And that fourthly, that the Quran that we have, this book here, is unchanged. In other words, exactly the same Quran that exists in heaven, that was sent down Muhammad, that was completed at the time of Uthman in 652, that this Quran that I'm holding in my hand today, this is known as the Hafs Quran. The Hafs text is exactly the same and has been the same, unchanged for 1400 years. So those are the four claims. Now, I've given this before. This is nothing new. I did this at my debate with Shabir Ali back in 2014. So what I'm saying here is nothing new for any of you who are listening, if you're familiar with the material that I use. But those are the four claims that we're going to start with. When we look at the Bible as Christians, we would never make those four claims about the Bible. We never have. So we're not talking about the same thing. We know that the Bible was created. it was written by men. We even know who wrote them. We know when they were written. We even put the names to many of the authors of the different books. So we would never make the claim that the Bible is eternal, that it exists in heaven on some eternal tablets. We would never claim that the Bible was sent down to any one individual or a group of individuals. It was inspired by God, but it was written by men, as I said earlier in the first point. Thirdly, we would claim that the Bible was complete in its original form. So in that third statement, we would agree with Muslims that the Bible, as they assume the Quran was complete, we assume that the Bible was complete in its original form. But number four, we are very clear that the Bible has been changed in the last 2,000 years, and we know where it was changed. And we say so clearly in our modern translations. If you open up Mark chapter 16, verse 9, there is a line right there in my NIV, and it says very clearly that the verse 9 to 20 are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts. So we're very transparent about it. We've always been transparent about where these possible changes are. Now I say possible because we don't know for sure if these are later inclusions. But we do admit that if in doubt, possibly, if in doubt, then say so. Be clear about it. Be transparent about it. And we're asking the same of Islam. So what do Muslims leaders say about the Quran? What do the great leaders claim concerning their book? Fethullah Gulen, that the Quran text is entirely reliable. It has not been altered, edited, or tampered with since it was revealed. All Muslims know only one Quran, perfectly preserved in its original words since the Prophet's death, when revelation ended. Now that's what the cleric coming out of Turkey says. Suzan Hanif, who is a convert, says that the Holy Quran is the only divinely revealed scripture in the history of mankind which has been preserved to the present time in its exact original form. Abdullah Yusuf of Ali, who is the translator for the Quran, one of the major translators, says, so well has it been preserved, both in memory and in writing, that the Arabic text we have today is identical to the text as it was revealed to the Prophet. Not even a single letter has yielded to corruption during the passage of the century. Look at that, not even a single letter. Maulvi Muhammad Ali, who is from the Ahmadiyya movement, says the Quran is one, and no copy differing in even a diacritical point is met. There are and always have been contending sects, but the same Quran is in the possession of one and all. A manuscript with the slightest variation in the text is unknown. So not even a diacritical mark has been changed, according to Maulvi Muhammad Ali. Shabir Ali, Dr. Shabir Ali, a good friend, I've debated him 6 times. He used to say, during a debate that he was having with Tony Costa in Toronto, he said, Tony Costa pointed out that we have a copy of the Quran dating from 790 in the British Museum. That's the manuscript 2165, the Matl Codex that we're going to talk about later. Folks, that's 1,300 years ago. And we can compare that with what we're reading today, and we find them to be exactly identical. So Shabir Ali has always maintained that. He goes on to say, but what is important to notice is that throughout the ages of Muslim history, the Muslims have not quarreled over what the text is the text of the Quran, because the text was known through memory work and through the written materials handed down right from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing God be upon him. As I said, the 2 copies that were made 1,400 years ago, notice he's saying 1,400 years, one which is in Tashkent, Russia, that's the Samarkand that we're going to talk about later, has been demonstrated by Ahmed von Denfer in his book Ulam al-Quran to be an early copy from that time, and we find no difference from that copy to what we're reading today. So that's what the great Muslim scholars have been saying. This is the clerics, the pundits of Islam have been claiming. Not a diacritical mark has changed, not a letter has been changed. It is exactly the same Quran today as has always been for 1,400 years, according to Dr. Shabir Ali. Now, so what is our remit today? What will we attempt to do? What am I going to have to try to do in the next hour or hour and a half? Listen, we can't critique those first 2 points. There's no way we could even try to get into the context of whether or not it is eternal. That's nowhere. There's no way that we could even bring that into view. We would not try to talk about whether it was sent down, because those that took place in the 7th century, the first 2 compartments, we're not even going to investigate. It's the next 2 claims that it was completed at the time of Uthman, so 652, it was completed at that time, and that since that time, there has been not one change. It is exactly the same Quran today as as that which was given to Uthman, or that which Uthman compiled or had compiled in the mid-7th century, 652 AD. So we can only critique an archaic, complete, and unchanged Quran. So what we want to find, and this is what I want to ask, and I'm going to bring it right at the very beginning, what we're looking for is one Quran, dated from the mid-7th century, from 652 AD, forensically dated, that we can show and prove that it is from that time, that is complete. That means it has all 114 surahs, not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 60 or 20% or 50%, that is complete, all 114 surahs, and that the Quran that you can show me, that one Quran, is exactly the same as the manuscript that you're showing me is exactly the same as this Quran that I have in my hand today. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for one Quran from the mid-century, complete and unchanged. All right? That's my remit. So how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to look through 5 different areas. I'm going to look at the first 2 compilations of the Quran. We're going to look at that first. Then we're going to go into 6 earliest manuscripts of the Quran. And then we're going to look at the 2 layers of the Sana manuscript. And then we're going to palimpsest, as we call it. And then we're going to uncover the 4 carbon dating lab reports. And then we're going to end with the 31 different Arabic Qurans. Now, some of this is brand new to a lot of you. Others probably have heard parts and bits and pieces of it. Hopefully, for some of you, this will all be new. And especially for you Muslims who are listening. We're going to go through and we're going to talk about some damaging material today. It is damaging. I'm sure you're going to get upset. I'm sure in the question and answer period, there's going to be a lot of vitriol against me as a person. But deal and let's look and let's unpack and let's look at every one of these compilations, the manuscripts, the layers of the palimpsest, the carbon dating problems, and the 31 different Arabic Qurans that we have today. So let's go right in and let's talk about the first area, the 2 compilations of the Quran. Now remember, according to Muslims, what they say, there has been no difference, no changes. It's always the same Quran. Yet we find, if we look back at al-Bukhari, and we need to go back to al-Bukhari to understand what the Muslim claims are, because everything that Muslims claim comes from a source. And the source in this case was al-Bukhari, the hadith of al-Bukhari. Now, he died in 870. So this is written in the late 9th century, roughly 250 to 230 to 240 years after Muhammad's death. You then have al-Bukhari writing, and in volume number 6, hadith number 509 and 510, Akhbar number 509, 510, we really find about these 2 compilations. This is Muslims' material. So those Muslims who are listening, I'm using your material, I'm going to your hadith, and I want to unpack what al-Bukhari tells us about how the Quran was put together. This is not J. Smith speaking. Everything here we're going to look at here is from al-Bukhari. So there you see it on the right there. You can see the Arabic of al-Bukhari, volume 6, 509. And this is where al-Bukhari talks about the first compilation, the first codex, And he says in al-Bukhari, in volume 5, 609, that between 632 and 634, so right after the death of Muhammad, 2 years following the death of Muhammad, you have the first caliph, Abu Bakr, did not have the Quran written down. So when Muhammad died, the Quran had not been written down. And Abu Bakr was concerned, and he needed it to get written down because people at the Battle of Yamama were dying off, and many of those who were dying off at the Battle of Yamama were those who had memorized it. So he was concerned that it get written down. Bukhari admits that since many who memorized it had died, therefore a large part of the Quran may be lost. So this is Bukhari admitting this in the 9th century, saying this in the 9th century, already assuming that a good bit of the Quran has been lost because of those who had died, and they died with their memories. Zayd ibn Thabit, who was Muhammad's secretary, felt it was too difficult to write it down. He was called in front of Abu Bakr and Umar. The 2 of them were asking him to write it down. He said it's too difficult because it was something that even the Prophet Muhammad did not do in his lifetime. Thabit finally, however, agrees to do so, according to volume 6, volume 5. Sorry, this is actually, I have a typo here. This should be volume 6. Hadith number 509 and 510. So for those of you who are watching, I've got that wrong. It should be al-Bukhari, volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. A typo. See, even the J. Smith here can make mistakes. If I can make mistakes, you can see how these are made these mistakes that are going to be coming in as we're going to be looking at them later on this talk. So if you could change that to volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. Zayd ibn Thabit finally agrees, and he looks for verses collected on palm stalks, stones, and memories of surviving warriors. At times, only one person remembered a verse. We see that in the last part, the last 2 verses of Surah 9, ayah 128 and 129. This first compilation remained with Abu Bakr. He was the caliph at that time. And then when he died, it was given to Umar, the second caliph. And then he then gave it to his daughter Hafsa, who had been one of the wives of Muhammad. And according to tradition, she kept it under her bed for about 20 years. Now, this should be Al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 510. So just change the 5 and 6 around and you'll get the right score there. Hudayfa says, now we're into the second compilation. So now we're 20 years later. The earliest first compilation in volume 509 was in 632 to 634. Now we're in 652, roughly 20 years later. And you get a second compilation that Al-Bukhari talks about. Hudayfa was afraid that the people of Syria and Iraq had different recitations of the Qur'an. So he asked Uthman to have the Qur'an written down a second time, using Hafsa's first compilation as the model. Uthman orders three others to help Zayd ibn Thabit, Zubair, Alas, and Hisham to rewrite the text. And then, if the four had any disagreement, Uthman says they were to write it in the Qurayshi dialect. Now notice, written Arabic dialects require the use of diacritical marks and vowelization. We're going to talk about that little area as to why this is important, which those diacritical marks and those vowelations do not appear until the next century. Those don't even begin to appear until the 8th century. So it's fascinating that this is here in a 9th century reference by Al-Bukhari, redacting it back to what he thought was the problem back in the 7th century. Uthman then sends a copy to every Muslim province. Now, we've looked and we've asked how many provinces existed at the time in mid-7th century, and there were 9 provinces, including Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, and Nishapur. So, therefore, there were 9 different copies of this final compilation, the second compilation, put together at the time of Uthman and sent to 9 cities. Therefore, there should be 9 still existing today. Where are they? We're going to talk about that. Goes on in Al-Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 510. Once the copies of Uthman's second compilation were sent to the 9 provinces, Uthman, then ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Be burnt. Why would you burn manuscripts unless there is something you are trying to censor? Wouldn't it be great if we had all that to look at? Although before they had burned them and if they preserved them, we could then see what the original text was, or possibly put together that original text. We'll never know because they've all been destroyed. Now, here are some questions concerning Al-Bukhari. Now, here I got it correct. Volume 6, 509, Abu Bakr's first compilation of the Quran. Why did God choose a language which could not accommodate the Quran? Why, in his wisdom, after he already had the Old and New Testament, here 600 years later, he then chooses a new revelation, a final revelation, and yet he chooses a language which could not even accommodate the text? There was no diacritical marks in the 7th century. There was no vowelization, the Dhamma, the Kasra, the Fatha. These did not exist in the 7th century. So why would God choose a language that could not even accommodate his supposed greatest revelation? Hebrew and Greek already existed and were previously used. Why didn't he use either of them? Since they already there, God had already used them earlier. Why also did God choose a man who could not read or write? If this was the one ministry for Muhammad, this is the greatest ministry this is the reason why he was chosen, why in the world did God choose an illiterate man for his greatest revelation, supposed greatest revelation? Writing down the Quran and preserving it was his primary remit. So why didn't he do either before he died? Now, continue on with the same problem with that first compilation. Why did Muhammad not learn to read or write? If he was illiterate, he had 22 years to do so. Listen, when I took Arabic, I learned to read and write Arabic within 2 weeks there in London. I didn't understand Arabic, so I didn't know what I was reading, but I could easily read it and write it. I learned the alphabet. I learned all the grammatic. Well, the grammar came later, but I learned how to read and write it within 2 weeks. Muhammad had 22 years. He already knew the Arabic. He was fluent in Arabic. He grew up with Arabic. So why in 22 years did he not learn to read and write if this was his major mission in life? And what about his secretary, Zayd ibn Thabit? Isn't that the job of secretaries? Why didn't he write it down? Why didn't Muhammad commission him to write it down? since that was his job. That should have been his job while Muhammad was still living. Why didn't Abu Bakr, the first caliph, make copies and disperse them to the 9 provinces in 634, as Uthman did later on in 652? And you can see the names of those 9 places. Now let's go and let's ask about volume 6.5.10, the second recension. Let's ask some questions about that. How could there be dialectic differences in a mid-7th century? How can you have dialectic? Remember, in order to read different dialects in a canonical text, as the Arabic text is, it's a canonical text, you need to have diacritical marks. You need to have vowelization. These did not exist in the 7th century. So this whole notion that you must write it in the Qurayshi dialect doesn't make any sense if you know Arabic well enough. These diacritical marks and vowelizations were not introduced until the 8th century, so a good 100 years later, and they were not finalized until possibly another century later. Why did Uthman burn all the other copies? Doesn't that suggest that they disagreed? And wouldn't it have been great if we had them today so we could compare and see why they disagreed? Now, where are the copies of the Quran sent to the 9 cities? That's the elephant in the room. No one wants to talk about those 9 copies sent to those 9 cities. They would be only 1,400 years old. You go back to the British Library, those of you in London, you have the Sinaiticus right there in the British Library, which is 1,700 years old, almost complete. Right next to it is the Alexandrinus. That's from the 5th century. And that's another 200 years before the Quran. We have 365 either complete or partial manuscripts of the New Testament alone from before the 6th century. Certainly, we should be able to find one of those manuscripts, and one of those 9 that's only 1,400 years old. All of these cities that we named outside of Jerusalem are still in Islamic control today, and they've always been in their control for 1,400 years. Even one completed copy would suffice. Finally, why, if Uthman standardized the Quran to just one copy, are there now a multiplicity of different Arabic Qurans today? And we'll get into that later on in this talk. Now, let's see what the Islamic traditions say about this Quranic text. Let's see if Muslims today have even read their Islamic tradition. If you go back to the Islamic traditions, you need to talk about Al-Bukhari, the 6 major hadith compilers or compilation, including Bukhari, including Sahih Muslim, including Abu Dawud, Al-Tirmidhi, Al-Nasai, and Ibn Majah. Those are the 6 major compilations. We're also going to include another subsidiary one by Imam Malik in these quotations. Let's look and see what these people say, what these hadith compilers say, and look at the thousands of hadith that they were referring to. Bukhari, who had over 7,000, Muslim over 9,000, Abu Dawud almost 5,000, Al-Tirmidhi almost 4,000, Al-Nasai over 5,000, Ibn Majah over around 4,000, and Malik around 1,700. Let's look and see what they say. According to Ibn Abi Dawud, some verses were lost. According to As-Suyuti, some verses had disappeared. According to Sahih Muslim, some verses were forgotten. Then you have Sahih Bukhari talking about some verses were cancelled. According to Sahih Bukhari again, other verses went missing. Ibn Abi Dawud says that some verses were overlooked. And I'm going through these very quickly. You can go back and you can look at them, every one of you, in your own time when you look at the recording. This is being recorded. It'll be up both on John McClatchy's site and also on our Pfander Film site. It'll be up on both sites for you to look at so you can pull down these verses. And then some verses were changed, according to Imam Malik. Some verses were modified, according to Ibn Abi Dawud. Some verses were substituted, Sahih Bukhari. And in some verses were even eaten by sheep, according to Ibn Majah. So, lost, disappeared, forgotten, cancelled, missing, overlooked, changed, modified, substituted, eaten by sheep. Does this sound like a book which was compiled perfectly and completely? It looks like the earliest hadith compilers were very clear that much of the Quran had been changed, overlooked, modified, forgotten, canceled, missed, substituted, even eaten by sheep. Very clear that the hadith quotes say this. So why are Muslims making a different claim today? Why are they saying that it is absolutely the same and that it is complete and that it is unchanged? I'm just using Islamic tradition and I'm throwing right back at the Muslims. You need to come up with answers. Before you make these claims about a complete Quran that has been unchanged, you've got to deal with the quotes from your own sources, from your own Islamic sources. Now let's get into the manuscript evidence. And this is some of the most damaging material. Much of this I introduced back in 2014, 4 years ago, at the debate I had with Dr. Shabir Ali. For those of you who want to see the debate, you can go up online, go onto YouTube, and just type in the classic debate, Shabir Ali versus J. Smith. You can see it up there. It's about 2 hours long. And in that debate is where I introduce some of the difficulties with the earliest Quranic manuscript, the earliest extant Quranic manuscripts. Now remember, according to the Islamic traditions, we do know that 9 codices were sent to 9 cities. There's the list of the cities: Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, and Nishapur. They were sophisticated, literate cities where Qurans would be protected and preserved. So there's no reason not to find those 9 Qurans, those 9 manuscripts, those 9 original ones that were taken from the original. We do know, according to the traditions, that there were 4 metropolitan codices. You had Ubay ibn Ka'b's codex, became very popular in Damascus. He had 115 surahs in his Quran. Abdul ibn Masud became very popular in Kufa. He had 111 surahs in his codex. Abu Musa was very popular. His Quran became very popular in Basra. He had 116 surahs. And then you had Zayd ibn Thabit, the one that is used today, which became very popular in Medina. He had 114 surahs. So even, you can see their length and the contents are vary depending on which tradition you're going to look at. But let's look at these 6 earliest manuscripts. They include the Topkapi manuscript. These are the extant Qurans that still exist today. The Topkapi one that's in Turkey, there in Istanbul. The Samarkand, which is in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. The Metal Quran, which is right there in London at the British Library, Grid Black Gallery in the British Library. It's when I was just there in July, it was still out in display. The Paris Petropolitanus manuscript, which is in Paris and the Bibliothèque Nationale there in Paris, France. The Al-Huzayni manuscript, which resides in Cairo, in Egypt. The Sana'a manuscript, finally, in Yemen, there in Sana'a, in Yemen. So those are the 6 extant major manuscripts. Those are considered to be the earliest, the 6 earliest manuscripts. There are others that come later, but these are the major ones. These are the ones that people have quoted over the years. Now, what do the scholars say concerning the 6 earliest extant manuscripts? Well, to do that, before I even get into Western scholars, so many of your Muslims do not trust Western scholars, I'm going to use Muslim scholars. I'm going to look at the 2 best known Muslim scholars, the 2 that have been the only ones that have looked at all of these 6 extant manuscripts. Professor Dr. Ekmeluddin Ihsanalu, founding director general of IRCISA, and also Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Conference Research Center there in Turkey. And then more importantly, Dr. Tahir Altıkılıç. Dr. Tahir Altıkılıç is a leading scholar in Quranic studies, possibly in the world today, and ex-president of Turkish Religious Affairs, deputy in the Turkish parliament. This is the man who has done more work on the Topkapi than any other. These 2 men put together a book in 2007 called the Al-Musaf al-Sharif. Al-Musaf al-Sharif is the conclusions of their findings. Now, that was then printed in English, I think in 2013. I think I'm correct. And that's when I first got it. We now have a copy of it at Pfander. And so we have been using that copy. And that's the one that I wanted to introduce. But in the introduction, in the first 83 pages, they talk about all 6 of these manuscripts because they had access between 2002 and 2007. For 5 years, they had access to all of these 6 manuscripts. And that's why we're now going to look and see what they concluded. Now, Dr. Ekmeluddin Ihsanalu says this: we have none of Uthman's Musaf. He says it right from the very beginning. Nor do we have any copies of those Musafs. These Musafs date from the later Umayyad period. So they do not come from the early Umayyad, the later Umayyad period. The Umayyad period went from 651 up into 749. So the later would be up to 749 would be the 8th century. So they date from the 8th century. Dr. Tahir Altıkılıç says no serious scholarly work has been done on them. So all the claims about these manuscripts have not come from serious scholarly work. It's just come from opinion. These Musafs date from the early to mid-8th century. They are not Uthmanic nor copies sent by him. Let's look at the 6 and let's see the conclusions they came to. The Topkapi, early to mid-8th century. This is probably the most famous one and probably the one that probably is the most certainly the one that has the most text. It's about 99% of the text. However, a lot of the text that exists has problems because of the fact it has water damage. And according to some scholars, maybe only 78% can be read, but 99% of the Quran would be there. He says it is dated to the second half of the 1st century AH, that's after Hijrah. and the first half to the 2nd century AH due to voweling and doubting, which would mean to be early to mid 8th century. If you look, one of the problems is if you use AH, it's very confusing for Westerners or those of us who are listening to this, because you think you want to be careful that AH starts from 622. It doesn't start from the beginning of the century, of the Western century. And he goes on to say, even though we would like to publish this sacred text as the Musaf of Caliph Uthman, our research indicated that it was neither the private Musaf of Caliph Uthman nor one of the Musafs he sent to various centers. So he's very honest about that. He goes on to say, there are deviations from grammatical rules, lan, and spelling mistakes in the Musafs attributed to Caliph Uthman. Attributed, these are all attributes, they're claimed to be Uthman, but he's saying they're not Uthman. So that's why you be careful, Muslims, because you keep on saying these are Uthmanic. No, they're not. They're attributed only. They're only claimed, but not by the scholars, and certainly not by Al-Taqulij or Esanalu. He concludes, in the Topkapi manuscript, there are 2,270 instances where there is a difference from the consonantal skeleton of the Fad Musaf. The Fad Musaf is this Musaf. This is the Fad Musaf. It's claimed that. It's also known as the 1924 manuscript. The Fad is when it was then made canonical in 1985 by King Fahd. The differences, you can see many differences, and we're going to be going into this in the next months ahead. We'll be going into looking at all the differences. We have over 3,000 differences that we've been able to come up with now between these manuscripts and the Quran that we have today. But just as an example, you know what we conceal and what he revealed in Surah 14, verse 38. In the Cairene text, that's the 1924 canon, it says, you know what we conceal and what we reveal. So you can see it's changed from he to we, and from past to present continuous. And Surah 3, 158, if you should die or be slain, you shall not be gathered. But in the current text, it said, if you die or be slain, before him, you shall undoubtedly be gathered. It completely contradicts itself. So it's a completely different reference. It's a completely different verse from the Topkapi into the Cairene text that we have today. Let's look at the Samarkand. The Samarkand is probably the second most famous of the manuscripts. It was brought to London a few years ago at one of the exhibitions there at the British Library. I remember seeing it. It was physically there. It's a monumental text, very unsophisticated, kind of crude in its usage. Al-Taqulij says of the Samarkand, it is not Uthmanic, as it dates from the 8th century. 6 reasons why he discredits it: undisciplined spelling, different writing styles, scribal mistakes, copyist mistakes, written by someone with little experience with later editions. So he's very clear that this cannot be an Uthmanic, and it could not be a 7th century. It's an 8th century. It has many, many errors. And it only goes up to Surah 43. It's not even a complete Quran. So what is preserved in those 43 surahs? Within those 43 surahs, only one surah is complete. Now, why haven't we been told this? Why are Muslims not being honest about it? Even within the 43 surahs that exist, there's only one complete surah, that's Surah 6. 24 surahs are partial, and 18 don't even exist. So even within the 43 surahs we have, 18 of them don't even exist. Now, let's go on to the Ma'il Quran. The Ma'il Musaf, which is in London, this is the one that's best known because it's been in London. It's been studied by Dr. Martin Lings, who was curator for the manuscript section for many years. He became a Muslim himself before he started doing his work on the Musafs. And it's fascinating. It's written in Hijazi text. You can see it's a different text. It's not the Kufic text. It's slightly slanted. That's why it's called Ma'il, which means slanted. It also only goes up to 43. So 43. It is not a complete Quran. It includes only 53% of the Quran. It is dated to the 8th century, according to Al-Taqulij. Dr. Martin Lings dates it to the late 8th century. There's also a dispute between Al-Taqulij and Martin Lings, but both of them agree it is an 8th century, not a 7th century Quran. The Huzayni manuscript, which is in Cairo, in Egypt. Al-Taqulij and Isanalu have looked at it. They see it as a monumental text. It's fascinating. Dr. Al-Taqulij says on this text, this is not Uthmanic. It is dated from the early to mid-8th century. It was stated that the Cairo copy might have been written on the order of Abd al-Aziz bin Marwan, the governor of Egypt. However, the reason for reaching this conclusion has not been explained. People just claim it, is what he's saying. We share the view that this copy is not one of the Musafs attributed to Caliph Uthman. When you look at it, François de Roche, who's done work on this, he is considered the leading European scholar. He is the one that has authority over the Petropolitanus manuscript, which we're going to talk about next. He says that this is a monumental manuscript, and that means it's a large, you can see the picture of it, huge manuscript. Because of the monumental text, those were much later, and that's why they made them bigger to be more impressive. That's why he would even date this to the 9th century. Note the coverings over the text. See the blue arrows that you see there on the screen signify that something is being hidden. These are tapings. They're the coverings over the text, or centering the original written text so that it standardizes it to the text that we have today. And this is found over and over again. I didn't want to in this talk go into Dan Brubaker's material, but he has found hundreds and hundreds of these coverings over the text in these manuscripts. That wouldn't you love to be able to pick up the coverings and look underneath and see what is it they're trying to cover? The Parisino Petropolitanus manuscript, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, it's a very rudimentary text. It's fascinating. This is the one that Dr. François de Roche has done the most work on. There are corrections to the text. He says it disagrees with the 1920 for Kyrene Muslim in 93 places, and that's out of 328, which is the largest section. There are different fragments of the Quran in this one. The largest one only includes 26% of the Quran, and that's out of 328. And yet, even in that portion, to only a quarter of the Quran, there are 93 places where it disagrees with the Kyrene text, the 1924 text that we are using today, the canonical text. Written by 5 different copyists, later modifications with erasures and additions. And these erasures and additions is what Dr. Dan Brubaker has done in his research. We're not going to get into those today in this talk. When you look at the Petropolitanus, compare it with the Kyrene 1924 canon, just take a look at Surah 1437. Our Lord, I have settled some of my descendants in an uncultivated valley near your sacred house, our Lord, that they may establish prayer and make hearts among people inclined towards them. In the modern version, in today's version, it's so make hearts among. Now, what's the significance of that? People look and they say, well, that's not any difference. There's nothing really changed there. Problem is, if it is the Quran, it should be perfect and unchanged. But secondly, the difference is subtle, but it is different, because the repentance of the people is no longer a result of Abraham settling people near God's sacred house, as we have in the Petropolitanus manuscript, but instead their repentance is something Abraham is requesting of God as a result of his actions. Therefore, the so, according to the standard 1924 edition used today. You can see how that changes the whole intent of that verse. When you get to the Sana manuscript, probably the most exciting manuscript, it was only discovered in the 1970s, 1975, I think it was, only really looked at by Western scholars in 1981. And these 2 pictures on the left there are pictures from Dr. Garrett Quinton, my camera. I went to visit him, and he let me look at a facsimile. That is not the Quran there, just so anybody doesn't get upset. That is not the actual Quran. That is a facsimile. Those are pictures taken of the text that he and his wife took. Conclusions of the scholars. Karl-Heinz Ohlig, who also with Gerd Quinn down in 1981 from Saarland University in Saarbrücken, Western Germany, they flew down, and this is his conclusion. The Quran began to be compiled in the last 2 decades of the 7th century, with other versions continuing until the 9th century. He concludes about this text. Dr. Gerd Quinn, who's done probably more work than anybody else on this manuscript, says the oldest parchments and paper of any Quranic manuscript, this one is, yet more than half of the text is ambiguous letters which need diacritical marks for understanding. Adding vowels helped correct mistakes. Changes in the orthography, that means the conventional spelling system of the language, are found in geographical traditional schools, which he says do not exist until much later. And it's this that we need to look at now, because this is what's fascinating. When they look closer at the Sana manuscript, they notice that looking at it face value, discovered in Sana, these are just 2 pages of it, but when they looked at it more closely, they noticed that there was a fainted text beneath it, which suggests that this is a palimpsest. Now, what was a palimpsest? These were all written on animal skin, on gazelle, deer skin. And what would happen is that when you want to correct something, you would wash it off and then write over top. And that would be sufficient in the day they were written. The problem is ink begins to fade over the centuries. And ink that's underneath that had been washed off starts to come to the surface over the centuries. So that now when you look at it, you can see the faded ink starting to appear underneath the upper text, the upper layer. When they put it under ultraviolet light, like you can see here on the right, it then really exposes both texts, and they're able to then to take the 2 texts and separate them using ultraviolet photography. Therefore, you have the lower, lighter text underneath, and the lower text is dated to 671 to 705, and then you have the upper text dated to 705 AD and on and later. Now, you can. This is unpacking some of the manuscripts and some of the different manuscripts from there, but the questions that exist about the lower text. Why was the lower text erased and written over top? Possibly the text had faded and was illegible. Therefore, they had to write it over again. Possibly the text was inaccurate and needed correcting. Possibly the text was obsolete and needed updating. And possibly the text was nascent, a nascent form of the later upper text. This has all been all over the world, and this has been terrific. People have been speculating. And then we had Dr. Halili, Asma Halili. She wrote this book here, The Solid Palimpsest, which just came out last September. And I've got it in my hand. I've gone through it and I read it. And I'm going to now look at her arguments, and I'm going to unpack what she said, because she has been probably the one who has done the most thorough job of looking and actually writing about it in the English language. We would love to get a hold of Elizabeth Quinn's book on it, but it's only in German. It has not been printed in English that I'm aware of. Taken from her book that came out just a few months ago, The Solid Palimpsest. She says that both Dr. Gerard Quinn and his wife, Dr. Elizabeth Quinn, along with B. Sadeghi and M. Gudarsi, all of those who have spent time, those are the four major players who have spent time on the Sonnet manuscript, they all consider that the palimpsest is part of a complete Quran codex that is a vestige of a non-canonical reading. That's on page 15. Sadeghi and Gudarsi, along with Elizabeth Quinn, believe that the lower text constitutes in itself documentary evidence of a non-canonical Quran. That's on page 16, she says that. Sadeghi and Gudarsi believe that the lower text is related to the Quran codex of Abdullah ibn Masud. Remember the four metropolitan codices that I showed earlier. And possibly came from 652. They believe that the variants fit within the reports by early sources about the companion codices. Dr. Elizabeth Quinn disagrees with them and believes it is not Uthmanic and not from Ibn Masud's codex, but suggests that the lower text was in the process of being corrected and made more precisely canonical. She considers the two layers as stages in a process of canonization and explains that the various categories of correction as attempts to standardize the lower text. However, they all agree that there are more variants in the lower text than in the upper text. So they do agree on some things. According to Hasma Hilali, this is her opinion from her book. She admits that the radiocarbon 14 dating of the two samples of sonnet parchment date between 543 to 643 and 433 to 599. Remember, that's of the animal skin, not of the ink. Note that the median halfway point, known as the bell curve of the first date, is 593, which is earlier than the first Quranic revelations in 610. That's problematic. Note that the entire second date, 433 to 599, precedes not only most of the Muhammad's life, which is 570 to 632, but precedes the beginning of the Quranic revelation itself in 610. So that's also problematic. Hilali also admits that there are no similarities between the lower text and the Quranic variants available to us following the Sunni as well as Shiite compilations. So she's aware of the fact that these do not follow any of the later schools which refer to variants that come out in the 8th and 9th century. This is something completely different. Her conclusions? Note that these conclusions all fall within the classical narrative. So she's making sure that her conclusions all fit the classical narrative that the Quran was compiled by Uthman, and then that the Quran we have today, yes, it has variants, but they're not really important. She says there are deviations, as Elizabeth Quinn calls them, or variants, as Sadeghi and Gudarsi call them, in the lower layer of the palimpsest. We can only find 63 verses in that lower text. And in those 63 verses, there are 70 variants from that, which is the 1924 canonical text that we use today. Hilali therefore believes the lower text was a product of a reading circle. That's how she excuses it. It's a bunch of students, and they're just reading it out loud, and this is what they've written down. The upper text, or the later text of the palimpsest, contains variants as well. She admits that, and we'll talk about these later. Therefore, both the lower and the upper texts were corrected significantly. So she admits that. Dr. Elizabeth Quinn's conclusions all fall outside of the classical narrative. Now, she has the freedom to do that. I have a feeling that Hilali did not have the freedom to do that, and that's why she kept it within that classical narrative. Elizabeth Quinn is not a believer, therefore she doesn't have to. She's not stymied or shut down in her conclusion. She can conclude what she sees in front of her. And so she said that the lower text is not Uthmanic, nor from Ibn Masud's Quranic. So she concludes that the lower text was in the process of being corrected and made more precisely canonical. Thus, the two layers were stages in a process of canonization. She suggests that the corrections predate the upper text and were so many that at some stage the corrector abandoned the corrections and the text was palimpsested. That's why they just, rather than continue to keep changing it and even explain to people, you must say it this way, you must say it that way, rather than even put that in the text, they just erased it and then wrote over top with their final form, much like we do when we're deleting and then copying and pasting on our computers today. When you look at these two texts, the upper and lower, you can see them there. These are all the verses that are found in the lower text along with the upper text. And you can see there's a lot more verses in the upper text than there are in the lower text of the Sana manuscript. Of the lower text, there are 63 verses, yet 70 variants, including verbs and nouns, article differences, participle differences, conjunction differences, preposition differences, isolated letters 29 times, expression differences, entire sentence in 60 times. So let's look at some of the examples. Here you have the Sana palimpsest on the left, and then you have the Cairo 1924 manuscript that we use today, the present-day Quran. And they said, our hearts are wrapped. But in fact, Allah has cursed them for their injustice. So little is it that they believe. In the modern, today's version, it says, but in fact, Allah has cursed them for their unbelief. So it's either injustice on one side has been changed to unbelief. You can see that changes the context of the whole verse. But those who have believed and emigrated and they did jihad, struggle in the name of Allah, with their money and themselves, has now been changed in modern day is did jihad in the name of Allah. So where's with their money and themselves? That's completely missing. So you can see that has been taken out of the text. Now, this lower palimpsest says, so travel freely throughout the land 4 months, but know that they do not escape Allah and his prophet. In the modern 1924 text, in his prophet has been taken out. You cannot escape. It's not they, it becomes you cannot escape. Not they, third person plural, but it's now you, second person plural, cannot escape. And his prophet is completely missing. So there is a huge difference between the two texts. In the Sana palimpsest, the lower palimpsest, it says, they have exchanged the signs of Allah and their oath for a small price and averted from the way of Allah. That now is, they have exchanged the signs of Allah for a small price and averted from his way. Wait a minute. What about their oath? That's been taken out. That's completely missing in the 1924 Qayyim text. And why don't you fight at people who broke their oaths? And they were the first to start aggression, and they intended to drive out the prophet. Now it's changed to, will you not fight? So one is a suggestion, now it's a question. Will you not fight in the modern version? And they intended to drive out the prophet, and they were the first to start. Completely changes the two words and puts them ulta pulta, one before the other, completely changed from what we see in the Sana manuscript. In Surah 9, verse 17, it says, it is not for the polytheist to maintain the mosque of Allah, witnessing against himself with disbelief. These are those whose deeds fell in this world and the next. That has now changed. For those, their deeds fell worthless. Wait a minute. In this world and the next. Where's that? Worthless is not part of the Sana. It's now added into the Qayyim text, and in this world and the next is completely missing. The mosques of Allah are only maintained by those who believe in Allah in the last day. And he did jihad in the name of Allah and did not fear anyone but Allah. For it is expected that those who are successful will be the rightly guided. Now it's been changed to those who believe in Allah in the last day, perform the salat. Wait a minute, where's jihad? And give the zakat. Wait a minute, where's that? That's not in their Sana manuscript. And fear none but Allah. It is they who are on true guidance. No, according to the Sana, it's those who are successful. Been changed to completely guided. But you can see what happened to jihad and what happened to fear of Allah. Fear is there, sorry. What happened, where did zakat come from, and where did the salat also get introduced into the text? Ask forgiveness for them, or do not ask forgiveness for them. If you should ask forgiveness for them 70 times, Allah does not forgive them. Indeed, Allah does not guide. That's in Surah 9, Ayah 80 in the Sana palimpsest. In the modern text, Allah will not forgive them because they disbelieve in Allah and his prophet, and Allah does not guide. Now suddenly, his prophet is introduced into something that was not there. Now the prophet is introduced. Why? Because, not indeed, but because they disbelieve in Allah. So you have a completely new injunction added to the Kyrene text that you don't have in the Sana palimpsest. O you who have disbelieved, do not enter the houses other than your own houses until you seek welcome. Now, in the days today, it's until you seek welcome and greet those in them. So here's a whole other injunction that's added along too. Seek welcome, you must also greet them. So you can see that completely changes the word, completely changes the verse, and completely changes the context. Go back, then go back, for it is good for you. Indeed, Allah is knowing of what you do. Now it's changed. Then go back, for it is pure for you and Allah. Instead of just going back, it now becomes pure. And if you take a look at the upper, those are the lower variants. Now, if you look at the upper variants, we won't go through them because I see we're running out of time and I need to keep going. You can see, and you can go through these. Just look at the variants that you have here in the upper text. So even the upper text has variants from the canonical text that we use today. Conclusions. The lower text is dated to the late 7th century, and there's a 50-year gap between the two layers. This could suggest that the upper text is a later correction of the lower text, or one could question the dating of the lower text, since ink cannot be dated. Only the skin of the animal can. There are variants in the upper text as well. This suggests that a standard text had not been canonized even by the early 8th century. The view that these texts are results of reading circles, that's Hilali's argument, is fallacious because two things. First of all, parchments are very expensive and would not be wasted on reading circles, on students. Secondly, Muslims would not have preserved these reading texts for 1,400 years, but would have thrown them away and would have certainly preserved the more important canonical texts. More conclusions. Puin, Sadeghi, Gudazi, and Hali all agree that there are many variants in the lower text. 70 variants in just 63 verses. This proves that this is not a standard Quranic text. Elizabeth Poon suggests that there is a pre-Quranic text which doesn't correspond with any of the known 8th to 10th century narratives on the variants, and all of the lower text variants change the meaning of the text. See the examples that we gave above. And here's a niggling problem. The biggest difficulty with these two layers are, number one, they are the oldest Quranic fragments in existence today. Number two, all the other extant manuscripts are more recent. Number three, so why are these layered palms the earliest ones? Why is it we don't have the later ones as early ones? Why are these, the ones that are completely different from the later ones, why are they the earliest? And where is the original Quran from which this supposed reading texts were derived? We're still waiting for that, and we'll keep waiting. And then finally, are these two palimpsest layers an example of the nascent Quran in its early formation? Are either of these two layers parallel to the eternal tablets in heaven? Since these are so different from the Quran we are using today, then where is the original manuscript for the 1924 Hafs text used around the world? Finally, both of these two layers prove once again that there were intentional human interventions in the Quranic text from the very beginning, because we're looking at the earliest manuscript in existence today. The Sana is the earliest. And the lower text would be the earliest of all the manuscripts we have today. Now, let's talk about radiocarbon, because I've heard Muslims after Muslims talk about the Birmingham folio and how the radiocarbon proved that there was this oldest Quran in Birmingham that existed at the time of Muhammad. So let's look at the 4 carbon dating lab reports, because remember, there's not just one laboratory that is looking at these manuscripts. There are 4 labs. And this is from material that comes from Julien Christian Robin in 2015, who wrote about l'Arabie dans le Coran. Robin looked at the carbon dating research, which was carried out on 9 separate folios of the Sana collections. This is the most exciting one, the Sana collection that we've been talking about just now. These carbon datings were carried out at 4 different laboratories, including Lyon in France, Kiel in Germany, Zurich in Switzerland, and Oxford in England. Now take a look at the graph, and this is what he found. When you look at the Lyon reports, the four markings on the left. Look at the blue one, that's the Sana A from Lyon. The red one, that's the Sana A from Kiel. If you look at the one from Lyon, it goes from the late 300s up until the late 500s. When you look at the one that's done in Kiel, in Germany, it goes from the 400s up until a little after 450. When you look at the same parchment, same manuscript, when it was put under carbon dated, the green arrow, it goes from the late 400s up until around 550. And when you look at the Oxford, it goes from about 425 up until 600 from Oxford. And then when you look at B from Lyon, I'm sorry, that's B from Leon. When you look at the Oxford one, goes only from 500 to 550. Then when you look at Sonnet B, another portion of the Sonnet manuscript done in Lyon, that portion is dated from about 425 up until 600. Sonnet C from Lyon is dated to around 540 up until around 650. And then Sonnet D from Lyon is dated to 540 up until around 650. The Birmingham one is 568 to 645, and that's the famous one. Now, another Sonnet E is from 600 up to 660. Now, take a look at the life of Muhammad. That's the two blue dots there. That's his life, 570 to 632. And then look at the Uthmanic recension. That would be 652. Now, do you see a problem when you look at that graph? Look at the Uthmanic recension. Look how late it is. And look how almost all of these carbon datings are earlier than that. 4 of the datings are from 4 different labs, but date the same manuscript page. That's a Sonnet A. Note that these have 95% probability ranges. When using the bell curve, we know that the highest probabilities are near the center of the bars and not the ends. That's what our Muslim friends have been telling us. I mean, I can believe how this keeps on going, that you need to look at the ends, and that's the 95%. No, that's not correct. It is the center part, what they call the bell curve, which is the most authoritative part. The Sonnet B, C, and D manuscript pages were dated in Lyon. The Birmingham folios were dated in Oxford. All 4 of the Sonnet A examples, dated at 4 separate laboratories, completely predate Muhammad, completely predate the Quran, and predate Islam. All the folios, including the Sonnet A, B, C, and D, and the Birmingham folios, except for E, predate the Uthmanic recension. Therefore, something is seriously wrong here. Now, Dr. Mark Dury, who has been writing about it, and he and I have been in communication about it, he says possibly there's something wrong with the carbon dating. Perhaps the sheep were eating a lot of seafood, which is older carbon, or the standardization is incorrect. The parchment was being stored or maybe the parchment was being stored for a long time before using. In other words, it had to be stored for 200 years before they used it. The traditional dating, number 3, of the Quran is wrong, is what he's saying, possibly. And the Quran was really created much earlier, sometime around 450 to 580, and that the Muhammad story was then attached to it much later. Dr. Dury noticed that none of the really early manuscripts seem to have verses referring to Muhammad in them. Those passages are missing in the earliest verses, in the earliest manuscripts. Is this a coincidence? Or could this be a combination of all the above? Now, my solutions, when I talked to him, I agreed that this graph is indeed disturbing. There is a possibility, a problem with carbon dating due to its inaccuracies. That's his point A. Due to the expensive nature of the animal skin, it is highly unlikely, however, that these many skins were stored for such a long time before they were used. That's no to point B. The traditional dating of the Quran is probably at fault because it comes from us from the 9th century, which is simply too late to be credible. And since Muhammad is not listed in the earliest dated folios, this suggests that the Quran is copied from borrowed material, which would naturally predate Muhammad and the Quran, and thus Islam. Conclusions. The RC14 dating of the Sonnet A, B, C, and D and Birmingham folios suggests that these texts are much earlier than was previously considered. Since all 4 Sonnet A examples dated at 4 laboratories completely predate Muhammad, the Quran, and Islam, these must be earlier Arabic writing from which the writers of the later Quran was borrowed. All the folios, including the Sonnet A, B, C, D, and Birmingham folios outside of E, predate the Uthmanic recension. Therefore, they all predate when the Quran was purportedly written down, i.e. 652 AD, proving why they do not agree with today's Quran. Can you see why these are problematic? So be careful about using radiocarbon dating. It looks like if you're going to look at just one dating from one laboratory, the Oxford laboratory for the Birmingham, you've got to look at Lyon, Kiel, and I even got into what is coming out of Arizona, the new laboratory that is now also dating. That's for another time. Now, what about the Qurans that we have today? Are they uniform? We're going to talk now about the 31 different Arabic Qurans that we have today. Now, before that, we need to know what we're talking about, and we need to look at what these texts are. If you look at that picture on the right, that's the Samarkand manuscript. It is a skeletal script. It is a canonical razm, and that's the word that's used in Arabic to talk about the consonantal text, the razm. These are letters without diacritical marks, which are dots above and below the lines. These are letters without any vowelization, the fatha, the dhamma, or the kasra, that make the the u, the e sound. Those are the 3 vowels. Here's another example of early razm. Notice there are no diacritical marks and no vowelization in that Sonnet manuscript you see on the left. Here's another one example. This is a Topkapi there in written in about 749. You can see the beginning of a diacritical mark starting to be shown. They have penciled in red, thus they could have been added at a later date. It looks like these were added at a later date. That's why they're in a completely different color. Here's an early Shiite rasm. Notice all these Ali's Quran, according to tradition, still with no diacritical marks. So why were diacritical marks and vowels needed? Well, let's see. When you look at the Arabic, it has 28 letters without dots in the 7th century. These are the 28 original letters. But of the 28 original letters, 6 are unique letters. The Alif, the Kaf, the Lam, the Mim, the Ha, and the Waw. These 6 letters do not need any and do not use any diacritical marks. So they are the only unique. All the other ones use and demand a diacritical mark or vowelization to distinguish them. So how is that important? Well, let's look at a smiley face. There's a smile. Add a dot above it and it becomes a nun. Add a second dot above it and it becomes a ta. Add a third dot above it and it becomes a tha. Now, let's take that same smiley's face, add a dot below it and it becomes a ba. Add a second dot below it and it becomes a ya. So when we put them all together, nun, ta, tha, ba, ya. Can you see the problem? You have to have dots because you can get 5 different letters. 5 different letters with the same smiley face, depending on how many of the 5 dots you use. That's why diacritical marks were needed. If we use the same 3 smiley faces and connect them together, let's look and see how this changes just one word with 3 smiley faces. When we add dots and vowels above and below the line, we can produce 19 different words. So if these dots change the meaning of the words, then they also change the meaning of the sentences, which can affect the subsequent theology as well. Thus, the diacritical marks and vowels are absolutely important. Despite what I hear Muslims saying over and over again, it does not change the words, it does not change the meaning. They do change the meaning. So let's just look at the variants. Now, Hatun Tash, who's a colleague of mine, in the last 3 or 4 years, she has been scouring the Middle East looking for Arabic Qurans, and she has found, when this graph was put together, she had found 26. Since then, she has now found 31. There's the Al-Susi, there's the Abi Jafar, there's the Yaqub Quran, here's the Duri Abi Amr al-Basi, excuse me for my pronunciation, the Ibn Amir, there's the Caliph al-Khashar, there's the Al-Layth Ibn Khalid Quran, here is the Warsh al-Azraq way, here is the Warsh al-Asbahani way. Oh, wait, 2 Warsh. Yeah, that's right, 2 different Warsh. Here's the Ibn Jamaz. There you can have the Duri, Abi Amr al-Allah. Hold on a minute, we already had Duri above. Isn't that interesting? Fascinating. The Shadape, yeah, way. And there you have the Al-Qasai. Here you have the, I'm not even going to get it. That's way too long. I'll really humiliate myself by trying to, and the same with that one. It's too small. I can't even read it. Here's the Hisham ibn Amr. There's the Al-Bazi. There's the Caliph. Here you have Shoba ibn Abi. That's another one I cannot read. And there's the Kalam al-Shab. I'm afraid I can't read that one either. Ibn Kathir. Here you have another Warsh. Hold on. That's the 3rd one. And that's the Rush. I can't remember that one. And the Shoba. And then finally, we have the Kalum. So there is 26 that you see on your screen there. She now has 5 more. She now has 31 of these Qurans. But these are in her possession. When she looked at them, she then put them and found out where all these names come from. And she put them onto this graph. So this is her graph. She's only had time to look at 23 of these Qurans. She has not had time to look at all 31. Just with the 23 Qurans, comparing them one with the other, she's come up with 59,776 differences. Now, so which is the Quran that we use today? The Quran we use today is this one that I've just circled in black, the Hafs Quran. That is the Quran that we use today. Now, what I want you to do is take a look at this graph again a little bit closer and look at all those cloud forms after every one. Look at Al-Bazi at the top. There's a cloud with the number 1094. That means that there's 1,094 differences between Al-Bazi's Quran and Hafs Quran that you see circled in black. Coming on down to Qalun, there's 1,732 differences between his Quran and Hafs that you see circled in black. Hisham has 1,347 differences. Khalaf has 2,629 differences. You come on down to Abu Ali al-Kharif, and you have 5,000 differences between his Quran and Hafs' Quran. Abu Bakr Shoab has and Aish has 504, though another one has 618. Al-Duri, two different Al-Duris. The first one had 4,645 differences with Hafs, and the second one he wrote then had 2,743 differences, and Al-Susi 3,000. So that explains those clouds. Each of the authors wrote their Qurans in the 8th and 9th century. So this is not new material. Look at the dates. These Qurans have been around for over 1,000 years. They are well known within the Islamic world, and certainly within the Arab-speaking world. So why haven't we been told about this? This is the elephant that's in the room that no one wants us to know about. The Hafs was created in the 9th century. Look at his date, 805. The others had thousands of variants from that of Hafs. So why was Hafs chosen by the committee in 1924 there in Al-Azhar University in Cairo, in Egypt, 94 years ago? Why didn't they choose any of the other 30 that you see here? These are the readers, they're the transmitters. You can look and see the differences when in your own time. Let's then look at these variants. Now, this is the one that Muslims always put up. This is the first one they put up. They prove that there's no difference. It's Surah 1, Ayah 4. Translated, the only owner of the day, Maliki, Yaumi al-Dini. The transliteration in the Warsh manuscript is Maliki, Yauma al-Dini, the king of the day. See, the owner of the day, whether it's the king or the owner, it's the same thing, is what they say. Therefore, there's no difference. And that's the only one they can ever come up with. But let's take a look at some other ones. Here is Surah 2, Ayah 10. In their hearts is a disease, and Allah increases their disease. A painful doom is theirs because they lie. But in the Warsh manuscripts, a painful doom is theirs because they accuse others of lying. Significance, are they doomed because they lie or because they accuse others of lying? Here you have chapter 2, verse 58. And we shall forgive you your sins has been changed to forgive us, and it shall be given you your sins. So who forgives sins? Is it we, God, or are they arbitrarily forgiven? In chapter 2, verse 129, and take you, it's changed to, and they took. Do they take this place now, or has it already been taken? Hus, take, is addressing a plural form. Here you have Surah 2, 140. You say has been changed to they say. Who knows better than Allah, you or others? Hus says you is in a plural form, so it's you, plural. Now, Surah 2, I 181, a poor person or poor men. For those unable to fast, can they feed one poor man or many poor men? Well, that makes a big difference as to who you're feeding. Great, in chapter 2, verse 219 is changed to plenty. So is drinking wine and gambling a great sin or plenty of sin? Is it something which is big or something which is much? Quantity or size? In chapter 33, verse 68, a great curse is changed to many curses. So are they to be cursed with a great curse or many curses? Is it something which is great or something which is many? Here you have repelling. Allah's repelling some men, and others for Allah's defending. So did Allah repel some men or did he defend against men? What action did Allah use? Repel, which is offensive, or defend, which is defensive? Surah 2, Ayah 271. And he will remove or expiate from you some of your misdeeds. In the Wadish, it's we will remove, expiate for you some of your misdeeds. So Allah removes our misdeeds or we remove our misdeeds. Can we, either this is Allah plural or humans, do what is reserved for Allah alone? Surah 3, Ayah 37. Allah made sure she was taken care of, she being Mary. But in the Wadish, it's he, Zakaria, took charge of her. So did Allah put Zakaria in charge of Mary, or did Zakaria take charge himself? Is the action here done by Allah or by Zakaria? In chapter 3, verse 79, you are teaching the book, has been changed to you know the book. Do believers teach the book, or do they simply know the book? Many people can know a book, but are not capable of teaching it. Here you have Surah 3, Ayah 83. Do they seek other than the religion of Allah? And to him shall they all be returned. Has been changed, do you seek? And to him shall you be returned. Up to now, the verse are all using they. For the verses before, all use they. But watch now changes it to you in this verse. Is this a plural form or a second masculine singular form? Who seeks and returns? That's huge. Surah 3, Ayah 146. And how many a prophet fought, with whom were many worshippers of the Lord, has been changed to how many prophets were killed. Did the prophets simply fight, or were they killed? Now, if I were a prophet, I would rather fight than be killed, as the former survives. Here you have the word of your Lord has been fulfilled from his words. That's interesting. Singular changed to plural. And then in the watershed, it's the words of your Lord have been changed, and his words. It retains the plural. One is singular, while the other is plural. Is the word of God fulfilled, or the words of God fulfilled? The singular Huff's word doesn't agree with the plural form in the second sentence. So you can see there's a problem with the Huff's here in that context. Chapter 7, verse 57. And it is he who sends forth the winds, bearing good news, has been changed. He sends forth the wind as scatterers. Does the wind bear good news, or does it scatter rain clouds? It seems the wind has two completely different functions here, depending on which you're going to look at. In the Huffs, it has my messages and my words has been changed to with my messages, with my message, singular. Does Moses have many messages from Allah, or just one message? Problem confusing the plural and singular tenses. 7:161, Allah forgives you. We shall forgive you your sins, has been changed to your sins will be forgiven. Now, does Allah forgive our sins, or are they automatically forgiven? Who forgives sins, Allah or another source? In chapter 7, verse 190, you have partners has been changed to polytheism. They ascribe partners to him, that means children to him, for Adam and Eve. It has been changed to they ascribe polytheism to him. What do Adam and Eve get, a child or polytheism? Either a person or a practice is given to Adam and Eve in this verse. 966, we forgive and we will punish. So if we forgive some of you, we will punish others. Has been changed in Ibn Kathir's to, if some of you are forgiven, others will be punished. Will the hypocrites be forgiven and punished, or were they forgiven? It looks like a student completely changed the tense later on. Chapter 10, verse 2, it says, indeed, this is surely a magician. In the watershed, it's been changed, indeed, this is surely a work of magic. Now, is revelation to a man the work of a magician or a work of magic? There is a confusion concerning whether it is a man or an action happening here. Here in chapter 15, verse 8, we do not send down has been changed to the angels do not descend. So does Allah send down angels, or do the angels descend on their own? Who does the action here, Allah or the angels? Surah 18, ayah 38. Better than this has been changed to better than both of them. Now, will the companion find a better place or a better place than two others? Who are the two others that the watershed is referring to that are supposedly better? In chapter 18, verse 86, you have murky water been changed to extremely hot water. Now, there's quite a difference between dark and gloomy and extremely hot water in the context there. Chapter 19, verse 7, one child to many children. I would want to know how many children I get to disbelieve, one or many. In chapter 37, verse 130, peace be upon Elias has been changed to peace be upon the family of Elias. Does only Elias or his whole family get blessed? I'm sure his family would like to know, wouldn't you? Chapter 38, verse 45, remember our slaves. And then it refers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In Al-Bazi, it says, and remember our slaves, singular, and then it yet refers to them. So obviously, there are three listed slaves in the Hafs and also Al-Bazi. But according to Al-Bazi, he doesn't know how to count because he puts it in the singular. So that's a complete error in grammar. Chapter 43, verse 19, you have Ibadu changed to Inda. One is who are slaves of the beneficent females. The other is who are in the presence of the beneficent female. Now, there are two problems here. Are the angels slaves of Allah or simply in the presence of Allah? Secondly, is it the slaves or those in Allah's presence who are to be made females? If I were an angel, I would prefer being in God's presence than a slave. Secondly, if I were an angel, I would prefer if only the slaves were made females. Thank you, not me, as a male myself. Chapter 46, verse 15. Doing good versus beauty. Are men supposed to do good or be beautiful to their parents? As a parent, I would prefer my son to be good rather than be good looking. Chapter 47, verse 4. Were killed or fought? Are we rewarded for being killed or simply fighting? Given the choice, I would prefer simply fighting rather than being killed. Chapter 49, verse 6. Verify it or stand firm. Do we verify a bad person's news or stand firm? Verifying news is much more practical than just standing still and doing nothing. Chapter 98, verse 6. Creatures versus the innocent. Are we Christians the worst creatures or are we innocent? What are innocent Christians, Jews, and polytheists doing in hell? So you can see that there's a total different theological significance here when you look at that. Now, we're almost finished. We need to come down to final conclusions. What was our remit today? Our remit was to ascertain whether the Quran came from God or from man. We were not concerned with its uncreatedness or its sent down, since we can't even unpack that happened. That is only nothing more than a claim. We wanted to find what we can look at, what we can handle, what we can, using forensic evidence. We wanted to find an archaic, complete, and unchanged Quran. That's what we're looking for. Those three things: a complete, archaic, unchanged from the 7th century. So we're looking for one Quran dated from the 7th century, really 652 AD, that is complete. That means all 114 surahs, and is unchanged, exactly like the 1924 Hafs Quran that is used today. So we want to find any manuscript that parallels this book here. That's what we're looking for. So where do we investigate it? We looked at 5 areas: the 2 compilations of the Quran, the 6 earliest manuscripts of the Quran, the 2 layers of the Sana palimpsest, the 4 carbon dating lab reports, and the 31 different Arabic Qurans. And what did we find? Well, with the first compilation of the Quran, that's Abu Bakr's versus Uthman's, the first and second, 632 versus 652. According to Islam, God chose a man who was illiterate in a language which was unreadable to reveal his last and greatest revelation. Though the Quran is supposedly eternal and complete, the early Muslims needed to compile 2 different versions of the Quran just 20 years apart. Once they compiled this final second canonical version, the Uthmanic recension, they then burned all the other copies which didn't agree, destroying any hope of finding the original. And finally, they then sent 9 copies of the canonized text to 9 cities, yet we can't find even one today in any of those 9 cities. The 6 earliest manuscripts, the Topkapi Samarkand Ma'il Petropolis Husseini and the Sana manuscript. According to both Muslim and secular Quranic scholars, there are 6 early Quranic manuscripts extant today, all of which were supposedly written at the time of Uthman. They are attributed to Uthman. Attribution, that's all they are. Yet none of them are dated to the mid-7th century, to 652 AD. They all date to the 8th or even 9th centuries. None of them are complete. None of them agree completely with each other, and none of them agree completely with the 1924 Hafs canonical text used today. So, obviously, these cannot be from Muhammad, and they cannot be from Uthman. The 2 layers of the Sana palimpsest, the last one, the most exciting, the 671 to 705 layer and the upper 705 text. The Sana palimpsest, both the lower and upper texts, are different than the Quran that we use today, the 1924 Cairene text. The lower text, with only 63 verses, has 70 variants, which don't correspond to any later 9th century textual variant school, and the upper text has further variants. The lower text seems to be a nascent Quranic script, which was then rubbed out, corrected, and then rewritten over top sometime between 671 and 705. When we look at the 4 carbon dating labs in Lyon, Kiel, Zurich, and Oxford, since all 4 Sana 8 examples dated at 4 separate laboratories completely predate Muhammad, the Quran, and Islam, these must be either earlier Arabic writings from which the writers of the later Quran borrowed, or our radiocarbon datings are incorrect. Secondly, since all the folios, including the Sana A, B, C, and D, and the Birmingham folios, except for E, predate the Uthmanic recension, 652 AD, they contradict the classical account, suggesting that we dare not trust that account to understand when the Quran was truly written. And our conclusion? Either we throw out the radiocarbon dating, 14 dating, as untrustworthy, or we throw out the much later 9th century classical account of the Quranic compilation. You decide. You know where I go on that. Then we come lastly to the 31 different modern Arabic Qurans that have been compiled and brought together, and had the work that's been done by Hatun Tash. No one seems to know how to define either the ahruf or the kirat readings. We didn't even get into that today. We didn't have time. Yet everyone is absolutely sure that there were 7 ahruf or kirats before Uthman. And they are equally sure that they made no differences in the meaning of the text. The ahrufs and the kirats couldn't have existed after Uthman, since he standardized it in 652 and destroyed all the manuscripts that did have the different readings. That's why he burned them. It's obvious today why he burned them. So these ahruf and these kiryats that Muhammad supposedly talks about all predate Uthman, not post-date Uthman. Yet now we find 31 different Qurans with over 59,766 differences between, and that's just the number we have currently. These differences not only change the meaning, but often the theology as well, as we saw with those slides. The conclusion? The Quran today was created in 1924, yet attributed to a student named Hafs from 805 AD, while disregarding the other 30 others that disagreed with him, though even his manuscript doesn't exist today. So it's only attributed to him. Oof, just makes your head reel. So what are the conclusions? What does this all prove? The 2 compilations prove that men changed the Quran in its earliest period. The 6 manuscripts prove that men created 6 different Qurans between the 8th and 9th century. The 2 layers of the Sana manuscript prove that men created a nascent Quran in the 7th century. The 4 carbon dating lab reports prove that men borrowed stories created long before the Quran. And the 31 different Arabic Qurans prove that men, even today, still read a variety of different Qurans. What do we find in all those 5 conclusions? Men, 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 men. Everything that we're looking at has been manipulated, changed, created, and rewritten by men. Thus, we can conclude from what we have researched and found that the Quran was created by men and not from God. The Quran was not sent down to Muhammad between 610 and 632. The Quran was not completed by Uthman in 652. The Quran was intentionally changed in the last 1300 years. Notice I'm saying 1300, not 1400. And that the Quran was finally compiled in 1924. This book I have in my hands, not this very book, but the compilation from what this book comes from is only 94 years old. Even, what's his name? The husband of the Queen is older than our Quran. Prince Philip is older than that Quran. I said this in 2014, and I know that Dr. Shabadati was angered by what I said, but I still hold to that. It looks like that this book that we have in our hand today does not come from the Sana manuscript or the Ma'il or the Petroponus or the Topkapi or the Tashkent. It doesn't come from the Husayni or any of those 6. It comes from a much later date, put together, attributed back to one man named Hafs in 805, whose manuscript we don't even have today, disregarding all the other 30, or possibly there could be as many as 37. The Quran can be found in 31 different Arabic versions, even today. By casting doubt on the Quran, our Muslim friends consider a better book, the Bible. We haven't even time to go into the Bible. That's for another talk on another day. Okay, I'm going to go and stop the slideshow, and then I'm going to open this up and make it available so that we can talk to the people who are there and answer their questions as best I can.
Well, thank you so much, Jay. Folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to ask a question of Dr. Smith, then just click the raise hand button at the top of your screen, and I'll be happy to promote you to panelist and give you the opportunity to go back and forth and dialogue for a bit. Or you can also submit questions by hitting the Q&A button at the top of your screen in textual form also. We have quite a few submitted questions. We have 10 so far, and we also have a couple of hands that are raised. Let's go to a friendly Muslim interlocutor. Just bring him up. Ijaz, go ahead.
Johnson, can you hear me? Hello.
I think there's too much background noise for it to be viable.
Listen, I see 2 questions up there. Let me just go. He says, why is J. Smith afraid of discussing this topic? Why is J. Smith avoiding the paper where Ijaz Ahmed directly refuted him using scholars he appealed to? We have written the rebuttal. We have sent it out. Obviously, he doesn't want to read it, or he's not aware of it. He needs to look at the rebuttals we gave to that. We gave these way back in 2014. In Christmas of 2014, we had rebutted all that material.
Okay. Let's bring up another questioner.
Why did you leave England for the USA? When are you? Okay. I gave 25 years to England and Europe. I have spent an awful lot of time. My wife gave me 25 years to live in England. I need to go all over the world now. And to do that, I need to be here in the United States, which I'm going to be using as a base to go to 43 countries. So I'm going to be starting now. I'm supposed to be, in fact, right now, I'm supposed to be in India. I should be doing this from India with you, John. But because of the grace of the Indian government, they never gave me a visa. So I'm stuck here in the United States for the time being. I was born in India, so I should be able to get an OCI document. That's what I'm going to work on next, so that I can get to India and help our brethren out there. There's an awful lot of work yet to be done, but it needs to be done from here to the rest of the world.
I've promoted to panelist another individual called Map Control, or Abu Ayub. Are you with us, Abu?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for having this very unique conversation about the Quran. So I just had a couple questions for you, Jay.
Yeah.
First off, do you know Arabic? Do you know how to read Arabic?
I can read and write it. I'm not fluent in it, and I would not say that. I would not consider myself a scholar of Arabic. And you know, everything that I'm using has nothing to do with my research.
Yeah.
Nothing more than
I'm not trying to find a got you question. I'm really sincerely, because it's basically setting up my next question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you stated before that, okay, Hatun and some of the researchers are trying to find a Qur'an or a website or some type of software where you can compare all the qira'ats together.
Right.
Right. Have you found anything yet?
We have been. I haven't done any of this work on it, so not me personally. What we are doing is we're using Arabic scholars to do this for us. I can't give you their names there. They will, when they are ready to go public, they will go public themselves. What they ask Hatun and I to do is to make it public so that people can look at it. I'm located in the Middle East. I'm located in Kuwait. I have available multiple scholars. We do have these types of softwares. They're readily available. And I have done this research personally. So my question to you is, this is a build-up to it. Okay, there are differences that you said you found there. The first thing I just state off the bat that none of the scholars before in Arabic ever shied away from this. You can find multiple tafsirs that actually explain the various readings. Do you agree with that as well? Yes. Listen, what's fascinating to me is that these scholars that they've known about this for 1,000 years, as I said earlier, if they knew about them for 1,000 years, why are Muslims claiming that there are no differences, that there are no diacritical differences, that there is no difference in the text, when this is well known in the Middle East and certainly when in the Arab-speaking world?
Well, my next question to you would be
for the Pakistanis and the Indians and the Bangladeshis who don't know Arabic and are not aware of the enormous amount of research that you're referring to.
I think that this is it's a problem with modern day semantics, but previous generations, there was no problem with this, the various readings or the understandings of verses itself. And I think that you, as a person that knows the Bible and Hebrew, that there can be different interpretations, even of a word. Set aside the reading. If there's a different interpretation of the word, the text itself can still stand, right or wrong. Okay. So my question to you, final question to you is, and I would actually request that you make this research, ask your friends, and then come back and tell us, are there in the 31 or the 21, it depends on the qira'at, are there ones that there is no difference? Are there verses where there's no difference at all between all of them? And I would suggest, do you know this? Have you ever?
I could answer that right now. There are many verses that are no difference between all of them.
Okay, thank you. So then that means that we do have in the tradition that it goes back. There are some verses which there are no differences at all. For example, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You can go and you can look at all of them together. They're all exactly the same. So would you say that this for sure would at least go to the 1st century, the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim?
Oh, now you're asking for me to say something else. Now, remember, there are some verses that are exactly the same. I assume you're referring to the transmitters that we were talking about from the 9th and 10th century. I'm sorry, from the 8th and 9th century. Those from the 8th and 9th century, all of these qira, these ahruf that we're referring to, look at the dates. They are from the 9th century primarily. So for the last 1,000 years, yes, there are verses that are the same. What's fascinating is that around the 9th century, you get a whole variation, such a variation of ahruf and kiryat. The ahruf and the kiryat, I will say this, Abu Ayyub, is not the most damaging material. The more damaging material is the difference in verses in the razm, the razm differences. Those are the ones from the original.
Sorry, Jay. But, okay, when we're talking, the ahruf are not considered qira'at. They're different. I just want to make that point real quick.
Listen, and Abu, I will talk to maybe 5 different Muslims, and they'll have me 5 different definitions of what ahruf and qira'at. That's one of the frustrations.
No, there are differences between the two. Jay, there are differences between the interpretation of ahruf and the interpretation of qira'at. But there are 7 ahruf and there's 10 qira'at. And then from the 10, each teacher had 2 students, 2 main students, which makes it 20, and they varied. And the reason why, so you can't say they're the same. This is a big problem. But the 7 ahruf itself, the scholars have basically made multiple explanations, but they know that it was done to facilitate and make it easier for the various tribes there, the dialects. So
Abu, listen, we can agree on this, but in leaving this, let me just say this one point. Even the reference to the 7 ahruf, the 7 ahruf comes from 9th century attributions of these 7 ahrufs. If there were, let's just say hypothetically, there were 7 ahruf, those would have all been expunged by the time, if Uthman had created that second compilation, they would have been expunged by 652 AD. So they would not exist in the 9 copies.
That's a difference of opinion. There are scholars. There's 3 main opinions on this. One opinion believes that it was completely wiped off. That's one opinion. One opinion is that Uthman left a little bit left for the people at that time, but he stuck to the original Qurayshi dialect when he could. And then the third one is no, that then all the qira'at have the various in it.
But how do we even know any of this, what you just said?
Because our religion is based on tradition, Jay.
The manuscript is
based on tradition. The same way that we approach the ahadith, it's based upon tradition. And
which
that's
only gets started in the 9th century. So again, this is all speculative.
It doesn't matter if it started in the 9th century. Do those people claim that it goes back to the Prophet? Set aside, does Hafs, you said Hafs created a new version of the Quran. Did he say I'm creating a new one, or does he say this goes back to the Prophet Muhammad?
Oh, I'm sure they all claim that, just like Muslims today are still claiming that.
There you go.
But again, let me finish with this. Let me just leave this with you. Until you can show us where these qira'ats and these ahruf exist in the original manuscripts, which you can't because they don't even exist, can you then see why we're always going to be speculate on this? So is there an original
manuscript that goes to the time of the Old Testament that goes,
But we're not making the claims about the Old Testament that you're making about the Quran. None of us would claim that we have the original of the Old Testament. We would never make that claim. Okay?
You're telling me that you don't believe you have the original Old Testament in your hands now?
We would never make the claim that we have the original. I've never made that claim. I don't know if you were at the very beginning of this talk. I made that very clear. We would never make the 4 claims you make about the Quran concerning the Old Testament. Anyways, God bless you. Thanks a lot, Abu.
Thanks. Take care.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Abu. Let's move on to some other questions. So an anonymous attendee asks, I'm a total layman in this area, so do Muslim scholarship use a form of textual criticism and list the known variants in an apparatus further editing it with further additions as time goes on? Updating it, he means. Updating it with further additions as time goes on.
This is a good question, Anonymous, and you may not be a scholar. That's right. The question you're asking is spot on. We're talking about 2 different things here, and Abu Ayyub was very good. I like what Abu Ayyub said. He made it very clear that the ahruf and qira'at argument is different than the canonical text argument. The canonical text argument, the razm argument, you might say, the consonantal text, is much more damaging for this kind of question than the qira'at and ahruf. And that's why you'll find many Muslims always bring it back to the ahruf and qira'at. They only want to talk about the ahruf and the qira'at because that they can say, listen, this is well known. We know about this, like Abu did say. We know about it. This has been around for centuries. If you come back to the schools, they're talking about it. We're quite transparent about it. What they're not telling you and what they're not saying is that this does change the meaning. So that's why we're bringing that up. And then also it disputes this idea that there was only one Qur'an and that Qur'an has never changed, that there's no diacritical changes. That's why we're even bringing it up, because we need to nip that in the bud. The much bigger the argument, the bigger argument, or the much more damaging argument, is about the earliest manuscripts and the Razm consonantal text. The fact that they don't agree, the fact that they are not the same as the Quran we have today. That's the big one that the Muslim scholars are not admitting to. And that's why we're going to spend much more time. Now, there is a new Quran gateway that's coming out. I have access to it now. Others who will have access. All of you can have access to this in. I think it's this next summer. They're making it available to the public. You can put on your computers and you can then look at all these variants. They have come up with almost 4,000 variants within these earliest manuscripts. When I did my debate with Shabir Ali, I knew only about 2,200 that were available at that time in 2014. We're now in 2018. Are the Muslims going to take these variants? We're going to be looking at all these variants, and we're going to show you how each one of them changed the text, how they change much more so than the ahruf or the kira. The ahruf and the kira is mainly just vowelization and diacritical marks. These variants are canonical variants. These are variants in words, in phrases, complete differences in the text of the Quran itself. You need to get a hold of the Quran Gateway when it comes out. It does cost money. It's not free. But we're now working on that. From the next time I come on and do a talk to you, I want to look at some of those variants and show how damaging they will be, concerning the manuscripts that we have, and the Quran that we have today.
Let me bring up Arkan, who's a Christian. To ask a question. Hello, Arkan. Are you with us?
Yes. Are you able to see me?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, good. How are you, Jonathan?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. Waiting for... okay. Jay, I have a question. Actually, two questions. What does Luxembourg think of the lower script of Sana'a manuscript? And, well, let's start with this one, and I'll ask you the next.
I don't know second about Luxembourg, and he is not quoted. And, of course, the scholars don't really go to Luxembourg. They
don't like him.
Sadeghi and Garduzo, his name is, in Sadeghi. They're going to the twins, Dr. and Mrs. both doctors actually, Dr. Guerre and Dr. Elizabeth. They're the ones that they're going to, because they're the ones who have done the most work. I don't recall that Luxembourg really did work on the Sana manuscript, so I would not expect Asma Hilali to even refer to him, because he is not one of the scholars who's been working specifically on this manuscript.
Okay, the reason why I'm asking is, while you were doing your comparison between Warsh and Hafs, I realized that oftentimes the Warsh, the manuscript or the Warsh tradition, sounds like some ancient Christian text or some Targum, Christian Targum or something, and that it's been changed into a Quranic standardized text later.
Arkan, you're coming up with a whole new kettle of fish. This is, we can talk about this, but this is something that we are realizing. A lot of the stories, the seeming biblical stories in the Quran, you can see are borrowed from other sources. The story in chapter 5, verse 31 of Cain and Abel and the raven, that comes from a pre-Islamic Jewish apocryphal writing written by Benathan John Uzziah. The very next verse, verse 32, which is about he who takes the blood of one as if he takes the blood of all, is actually a redemptive analysis on the blood of Abel, written in the 5th century in the Bar Sanhedrin, another 5th century document that is well known. We have it. We have access to it. That comes right after the story of Cain and Abel. So you can see that has been lifted out and put into the Quran, possibly in the 8th century. The story of Abraham and the going in and destroying all the idols, and then being thrown into a fiery pit in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71 of the Quran, that comes straight out of the Targum of Rabbah, another Jewish apocryphal account written in the 2nd century. The story of Solomon and Sheba and the hoopoe bird in chapter 27, verses 17 to 44. That is taken almost word for word right out of the second Targum of Esther. So these are Targums and these are apocryphal writings that are riddled all through the Quran. And these are those apocryphal writings that predated the Quran. And that's why I intimated in my talk that if you're going to do carbon dating on these stories, let's take the Birmingham Folio. Look at the Birmingham Folio. It talks about 7 sleepers. It talks about Dual Qur'an, Alexander the Great. It talks about also Solomon. Well, we know Dual Qur'an is a text that comes from 630 from Heraclius. This is one of his political text that he wrote in 630. That is predated, but it's referring to something much, much earlier. The 7 Sleepers is a well-known text that existed from the 2nd century on. And of course, the story of Moses comes right out of the Old Testament. Those are all predated. They would all predated the Quran, predated Muhammad, and they would all predated Islam. So it looks like they're lifting. They needed to put a Quran together. They needed to have stories, and they lifted these stories, these apocryphal accounts, not the authoritative ones. Why didn't they borrow the real accounts from the Old Testament? Well, the answer is very simple. It was the earliest translation we have in Arabic for the Old and New Testament is from the late 8th century. So that was not available to them. These stories were.
Yeah, it seems like it fits the carbon dating, the theory that it's most possibly that it's borrowed from before Islam. Fits more the carbon dating of the Sana'a manuscript that you showed us on the graph.
Now, and you notice I'm speculative of the carbon datings. However, if Muslims want to take the carbon dating, let's say the Birmingham Folio, that's 568 to 645, you've got 2 problems right to begin with. That's only one laboratory. That laboratory is Oxford. And that laboratory, their carbon dating, you need to use the bell curve. Most Muslims are only using the latest date, the last date, which is 645. Even 645, if you're going to use that date, that's still 7 years before the time of Uthman. So this is pre-Uthmanic. More than that, if that is the case, and you're going to use those carbon dates, you're going to have to go to the Kiel lab, you're going to have to go to the Lyon lab, you're going to go to the other laboratories, which are very clearly much, much earlier. In fact, they are 4th and 5th century. I didn't have time today to get into the new material that's coming out of the Arizona lab. That one puts it back to the 4th century, some of these stories. So
wow.
Be careful with carbon dating. Carbon dating is very inexact anyways. If you want to go with the carbon dating, don't just go with one study done in one laboratory and then published all over the internet. Go with all the laboratories and realize that the Sana manuscript, which is the earliest of all manuscripts, isn't this interesting? When they looked at one page of the Sana manuscript and put it into 4 different laboratories, you have 4 different dates. But all those 4 dates predated the Quran, Muhammad, and Islam.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Arkan, for your question. Let's see. Richard Copeland, who's a Muslim in the audience, asks, why cannot all the different qira'at or readings you showed be the Quran, as they are all linked to Muhammad through chains of narrations?
Good question. Yeah, and Richard, I would say yes, absolutely. And we kind of covered it with the earlier question by Abu Ayub. Here's the problem, Richard. It's all attributed, and here's the difficulty. What in the world and why are these all attributed to a series of narrations? Series of narrations are series what we know as isnad, and we're talking about isnad here. And the problem it is the Arabic word for it. Isnad means I got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from the Prophet. The problem with isnad is that it is dependent on oral tradition, hearsay. And the difficulty with oral tradition is that oral tradition, by definition, can be embellished, can be manipulated. We've done this. I don't know if you've done this when you're with your kids and you have a birthday party and you have one person. You start with one person. You tell them something in the ear. They tell it to the next person. They tell the next person. And by the time it gets down to the 10th person, what that person says and what you've told the first person are 2 different things. And if that can happen in a period of 15 minutes, can you imagine what would happen in a period of 200 years? 200 years of oral tradition. And that's why I'm very skeptical of oral tradition. I think everybody is skeptical of oral tradition. And Richard, though it's a great question, they all attribute it to so-and-so who got it from so-and-so who got it from so-and-so. Where did any of those so-and-sos write it down? Where did they write it down? Why didn't they write it down? They had all the right, they had all the means to write it down. Remember, by 652, within 20 years of Muhammad's death, they controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. By the time of Abdul Malik, the great caliph that builds the Dome of the Rock in 691, they controlled all of the land from Spain in the west all the way to India in the east. All this land was under their control. Are you telling me that in that long swath of land from Spain to India that nobody knew how to read and write, and nobody could write this material down? The fact that they have to depend on oral tradition for all their reference points proves to me that it is open to manipulation. And I'm so glad that we don't talk about, we don't have to depend on that for the Bible. We don't go to oral tradition. We go to manuscript evidence. And that's why we're bringing this forward. Forget about the oral tradition. Forget about the attributes. The attributes of train of names is what bothers me, because if this is the greatest revelation in the history of mankind, as Muslims tell me, if Muhammad is the greatest prophet in the whole line of prophets, as Muslims tell me, then why in the world did he not write it down? Why was it not written down when he was living? And if not, why was it not written down immediately after? And if it was sent to 9 different cities, where are those copies? The fact is, we shouldn't have to depend on narration. We should already have these manuscripts before us. We shouldn't have to depend on so-and-so who got it from so-and-so. The fact is, you only can go to the 9th century and 8th century and look at the 31 different Qurans that we do have there, that we have in our hands today from the 9th century, and they are all attributing them back to Muhammad. Who knows whether any of them are correct? There's nothing from Muhammad to support them.
And in the same way that you can make up a tradition, you can also make up an isnad chain, right?
Well,
so
if you know anything about Islamic history, you will know that this was done by Shafi in 820. In 820, it was Shafi who even stipulated that every hadith, every isnad must go back to Muhammad. But before 820, they didn't all go. A few of them went back to Muhammad, and suddenly there was an enormous accumulation of isnads that all went back to Muhammad. So these were all created after 820. How can you create them after 820? You're now in the 9th century. How can you suddenly create names that go back to Muhammad 200 years after the fact?
Right. King Servant asks, do you believe the Bible can withstand the same level of criticism you direct at the Quran?
Oh my, and this is what you're so good at, John. This is your area of expertise. This is why I would hand the floor over to you to answer that question. But I'll say, and then you can follow behind me. One of the reasons why we even have historical criticism. Historical criticism would not exist were it not for the Bible. Redacted criticism, source criticism, historical criticism, literary criticisms, the documentary hypothesis. This has all been leveled at the Bible from the 1800s on. We have had to deal with historical criticism for over 150 years. We invented the mode. We invented the science. The science only exists because of the Bible, and that's why by 1905 there was such an attrition of people leaving the church because of historical criticism that we finally did our homework and we decided to go back and look for the manuscripts. And that's why we are able now to find 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin Vulgates, 9,000 in other languages. That's 24,000 manuscripts we're looking at. Not just 6 manuscripts like that Islam has from the 8th and 9th century. We can come up with 24,365 of them that predate the 6th century. Not complete, but 3 either complete or partial that predate the 6th century. We have the 3 metropolitan codices that everybody knows about, the Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus, the Vaticanus. They all predate the Qur'an by 200 to 300 years. So when we had no other choice but to find manuscript evidence for our Bible. We had to look at the early church fathers' quotations. 86,000 of them that exist today, 36,000 of them that predate the 4th century, the 2,335 lectionaries that we now have access to. All of these are separate from each other, and they all do agree. And that's why we can make this claim for the Bible. But we don't need to make the claim for the Bible because we don't claim that the Bible has been unchanged. We know because of historical criticism where those changes are. And we admit it. As I said at the very beginning of this talk, we're very transparent about it. I don't know if you want to follow up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you folks want to go back in the Apologetics Academy archives on the YouTube channel, just go into youtube.com, type in Apologetics Academy, you'll find the YouTube channel. There was a webinar we did with Dr. James White a couple of years ago where he discussed textual criticism of the Quran versus the Bible, and I recommend going and watching that. You might also want to check out Wesley Huff's webinar he did for us on critiquing Bart Ehrman on textual criticism. So just a couple of resources I'd recommend on that. Let's see if Ijaz has his hand raised again. Let's see if he's able to, if he's got a better environment. Hi, Ijaz.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I can't come on camera. I'm really sorry. I was out in Starbucks. I went to watch Black Panther today, so you have to forgive me for being late.
It's okay.
All right, so could I get a couple minutes with Jay? Would that be okay?
Go ahead.
Okay, so Jay, it's finally good to meet you. I listened to you answering my question earlier. So I have a question to ask you. What was Dr. Tayyab Atakulich's conclusion at the end of his facsimile on the Topkapi manuscript?
Well, I went through it, his conclusions. Or maybe you weren't here when I went through that.
Yeah.
He said that this was the late first century AH, which would be the early part of the 8th century up until 749. And he said that there were 2,270 variants in this text with the 1924.
Yeah. Well, what was his conclusion at the end, the very end?
He said very clearly, this is not Uthmanic.
No, what was his conclusion in the last paragraph? What did he say?
I'll have to open up and find out what you were, because you're asking me.
He says that it is exactly like the Quran that we read today, from Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim to the final Surah An-Nas. So do you disagree with his conclusion?
Okay, let me ask you this. It's interesting that he has exactly the same, and yet he said earlier in that there were 2,270 variants.
Yeah,
so
because he agrees that orthographic variants. Because he agrees that they are orthographic variants.
The orthographic variants, yes,
Yeah.
because of the fact that they are different, therefore he is showing that there are thousands of variants, proves that they cannot be the same. Now, I leave that with you. I leave that with you.
Let's say that yet. Hold on, Jay. I think you're misleading yourself. Orthographic differences don't change the context. For example, he gives 3 words that account for those 2,000 variants. Hala, Atta, and I forgot the third one. Hatta and Allah. He says that there are spelling differences, but they're pronounced exactly the same. Yeah. So do you think that words that are spelled differently but pronounced the same, they change the meaning of the text? That's what you're saying.
We went through that, and we said they do change the meaning.
That's what his conclusion led to.
You're going to disagree with me, but listen.
No, I'm disagreeing with you.
Just to help you out, we're going to look at all those differences. We now have the Topkapi. We have, and the next time I come on, maybe we should just zero in on the Topkapi, since that's the one that most.
But Jay, that's what I don't understand. You're saying that the orthographic differences do not coalesce with his conclusion.
Consonantal differences to him. Change are different on the Topkapi with the 1924 that we have today. I'm not talking about
the 1924 is really different with the Aleph. I'll give you an example, Jay. What did the Turks do before 1924 with the Aleph? What did they do?
We're not talking about the Dagger Aleph. I'm not referring to the Dagger Aleph here.
No, what did they do? I'm asking.
He comes up with, but that's the only one that I've ever heard Muslims come up with. Oh, these are just Dagger Aleph. Only about 1/3 of them are Dagger Aleph. When we come back again, we'll go through the Topkapi. In fact, that would be a good session to do, just looking at the Topkapi and showing you, take out the Dagger Aleph, take out the Aleph, and let's see what the canonical differences are between the Topkapi and the one that we have today.
But you don't have to do that yet. It's already a 1971 thesis that did this. It's about 60 pages long. So are you not familiar with the basic literature on this topic?
We now have besides what they said in 1960, we now have
1971.
We have the material at hand today. You were here when I talked about the Quran Gateway. This is all not going to be.
I know. I sent a review of the website to Andy Bannister. I actually looked through the code and I presented some examples of mistakes for him. I actually have a review of the website on my own website. I watched all the videos. I had access to the database, everything. I'm quite ashamed that you didn't know that. So let's get back to the point. So Dr. Atakulich is saying it's the same. He points out orthographical differences, and based on your own scholarship, you disagree with his authority. Is that correct?
Listen, I'm going to disagree with him, obviously, because you're not going to hear what I'm saying. Nonetheless, rather than sit there and banty back and forth as you like to do, Ijaz, let's go ahead and let's not
get personal, Jay. Please, let's not get personal. I'm asking you to be professional.
and let's see exactly what we're talking about. Because I think people need to know. I think because I'm hearing this from Muslims all the time. There is no difference. There is no difference. These are
No, I'm admitting that there are differences. I'm not saying that there are no differences. We clearly agree that there are differences.
And please say that in public, that there are differences.
Jay, I've said that in my paper response to you that has like 30,000 downloads so far. Have you forgotten that? It's in the top 1%.
Responded to that. I don't know why you don't have. Maybe you didn't. You haven't seen our response to your.
Jay, I actually emailed you and you never got back to me. You told me 2 weeks later.
Sent them up. We put it up. You should have access to it. I'm sorry you don't.
Okay? Do you have the access to the? Where's the response? Where is it? What is it entitled?
Response to Ijaz Ahmad. It was done by a committee, a group of people in London. They did it in the late 2014. So we're talking about 3.5 years.
3 years later, and there's nothing to show for that. That's what you're saying.
No,
I'll give you an example, Jay. I'll give you an example. You quote Darush a bunch of times in that debate you did with Dr. Ali, and he says it's the same Quran. So are you saying that you agree with Dr. Articulate, you disagree with Dr. Fideli, you disagree with Darush on all the evidences that they have presented? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is this, listen, and listen to what I quote. When you look at the Topkapi is a mid-8th century manuscript.
Not mid-8th, you're wrong.
By the mid-8th century manuscript, you do have probably the best manuscript available, and that is the Topkapi. And it looks like it was probably, we don't know yet. I'm just speculating here. It was probably the one that all the others were being standardized to. Now that's telling in and of itself. Because what we're saying, what that suggests is that by the sometime after Abu Talib, which sorry, not Abu Talib,
Abdul Malik,
the Walid, the son of Abdul Malik, the Quran started to be coalescing, and so you have possibly I have to be careful because I don't want to quote on this. Possibly the Topkapi was the one that became the standard text. That is mid-8th century. So that is a good 100 years after the time, or nearly 100 years after the time of Uthman.
That would be incorrect, Jay. If you read Dr. Articulat's paper, he specifies that it was within the second half of the 1st century Hijri. When does the Hijri calendar begin? At 621, add 50 years? 71. So you're still within the 7th century.
That's what he says, or the beginning of the 2nd century.
Oh, that's the key word. It continues from the second half into the other half. Do you understand that?
And when does it end? When does the 1st century end? 719, sorry. 719, so the second.
Right, so it's between the 7th and the 8th. So why do you only say the 8th?
Look at AH with AD, and we're talking about the 8th century by that time.
Right, but he also says 7th century. So why do you only go to the 8th?
No, he said the second half of the
1st century.
The second half would be the beginning of the 8th century, and the first half of the 8th of the 2nd century.
Jay, hold on. Wait with me here.
19 on.
Jay, hold on, Jay. Let's work this out. Let's do simple math. 622 CE is when the Hijri calendar begins. Agree?
Right. And goes to 719.
Hold on. Add 50 years. What do you get?
And goes to 719.
Hold on, add 50 years, what do you get? You get 672. So it's between 672 and the early half of the 8th century. So why do you...
What he says. He then says the latter half of the 1st century AH
of the 1st century AH, that's it. You said it. Of the 1st century AH, so then why do you change it?
2nd century AH, the beginning of the 2nd century AH, which begins in 719. Yeah, Ijaz, listen, you can sit there and bandy around back and forth.
Hold on. I have it in front of me.
You don't get confused with the century AH and the AD Western equivalent.
I was muted by the host. They don't want me to speak to you, apparently.
No, I can hear you.
Yeah, he just muted me. Johnson, would you stop?
I can hear you. Fine, continue on. I don't know why if he did.
Yeah, I mean, just malicious. So I have it in front of me, right? He says, Articulate dates the Topkapi manuscript to the second half of the 1st century AH.
To the beginning of the 2nd century. But you can quote the whole thing. Don't just quote the first part.
I'm responding to your point that it's only 8th century. Why don't you agree it's also the 7th century?
No, I think very clearly, again, maybe we need to write to Articulate and say, can you be more...
no, it's in English. I've asked him, this is English. So he says the second half of the 1st century AH. Why do you deny that?
Well, I don't deny it. I said up till 719. from 672 up to 719 is a second half of the first century. But also he then concludes that it continues that it could also be the first half of the second century. Now, again,
he says that due to the vowel and the dotting. Hold on, Jay, he says due to the vowel and dotting. So the vowel and dotting was added in the first half of the second century, but the original text was written in the second half of the first century. What do you not understand?
That statement right there, even to the voweling, and the voweling was put on copy at a later date. You do know that.
Yeah, that's what he says. Let me read the quote again. Dates the top copy manuscript to the second half of the first century AH and the first half of the second century due to vowel and dotting.
There you go.
81.
So you've just said what I've been trying to tell you for the last 10 minutes.
No, you're denying it's 7th century.
I'm going with listen, I'm going with what most people interpret his writing as, and most people that I've come across do interpret it.
It's not what people interpret. That's eisegesis. You have to go to yourself.
You don't want it because you are stuck in that one little box that forces you to maintain that it has to be.
I've spoken to Dr. Artakulich. I don't believe that you have, so I'm coming for the authority himself.
But you also, Ijaz, you also have to be careful that much of everything that Muslims are going to say, including yourself, has to force everything into that box that it must be 7th century. Are you also going to tell me, Ijaz, that the Topkapi is the same as the Samarkand, which is the same as
I'm going to make those silly claims, Jay.
The Husseini, which is the same as the Sana. Are you going to say that they all agree as well? And that they're all
attack a straw man. So let me finish my point. This is what he goes on to say. There are 2,270 instances where there is dissimilarity between the Topkapi Musaf and the Fad Musaf. Most of them concerning whether or not the word was written with an aleph. With an aleph, G. Aleph.
Listen. Rather than sit there and bandy about on this, can we go ahead and and we will show you the differences between the Topkapi and also the
let's come to a conclusion if you don't mind.
Are you going to listen to me or are you going to talk over top of me?
I have a question for you.
I listened to you. I listened to what you were saying. You're not even hearing what I'm saying. You're talking as I'm talking. Be at least shut down. I know you're excited. I know you always...
Don't call me excited. I'm not excited. I'm not a woman who can get wrong.
When we're looking at these different manuscripts, and I didn't just bring up the Topkapi, I brought 6 major manuscripts. And you're assuming now suddenly that these all agree. Now you're saying...
I did not say they agree, Jay. I've never said that.
You're only looking at one argument. You're saying that Altakulich, and he has to say this, and I understand why he has to say this. But what you're going to find out is more and more scholars are now going to be looking at the datings. They're going to be asking very certainly difficult and damaging questions because the datings are not agreeing with a 7th century manuscript. Look at the Sana manuscript. Look at, were you here when we talked about the 2 different layers?
Yes, of course I know about the 2 layers. You know me. Hold on, Jay, let's come to an agreement. I have a question for you. One question, okay? Can we have this discussion live? Me and you choose the topic, we sit down and we discuss it.
Well, what I would like to do is actually talk about the Topkapi, and let's look and see. And
no, I'm set up a further date.
Let's get them, and let's look and see what the differences are between these manuscripts.
No, I'm asking
if there are differences. You're claiming there are no differences.
I never said that.
They're all 7th century.
I never said that.
You're claiming that the only differences are the majority of the difference are nothing more than alephs.
I didn't say that. Only specific to the Topkapi. That's what Dr. Kulich himself says. I've quoted it in my paper.
Okay, that these are mostly aleph differences.
That's what he says. That's what he says.
Let's see if that's true. Let's come back and let's see if that's true.
Okay, but Jay, I'm asking, can we set up a date where we can do this one-on-one in front of the public?
We can do it right now. We can do it in front of. We can do it on this.
Yeah, but I haven't prepared anything. I've just come from the movie.
We're not going to do it today, and I'm not ready to do it right now because I just got the Quran gateway. But if you say you have access to the Quran gateway,
yeah, I used to until November 2017.
Oh, okay.
There was a security error. I think I sent it to Andy. I'm not sure, but you should.
Why don't you ask Andy if he can give it to you again, since he's the one that's responsible for it?
Oh, no, he has to close it down.
Get in contact with John. Get in talk with John. Let's do another webinar and let's just look and let's just do a comparison.
You and me. Is that a deal? You and me. That's a deal.
That's a deal. We'll do it, and we'll do it on air with John McClatchy.
He as the moderator, correct?
I'm sorry.
With him as the moderator, correct?
Moderator.
Okay, so you agree. That's all I needed to ask. But do you have any questions to ask me? You have me at your disposal now.
Not really, no.
Okay, I have a question to ask you. I didn't hear it.
There's some other questions I want to get to. Hey, Josh, it's been great talking.
Let's stop there, and on some other occasion we can have Jazz and Jay in dialogue. But let's move on for this evening to some few other questions, and then we'll wrap up. Vladimir Sisig asked, are the slides used available for download? Could you perhaps email them to Jonathan, who can further distribute them to us in the Apologetics Academy for further use?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is when you're reading. Is it possible the Quran is conclusively inspired if that isn't real?
I'm reading from Vladimir.
By definition, whoever said, by definition, that cannot, because inspired means it's from God. Inspired, you can't. I mean, a person can be inspired suddenly. I'm inspired because, but they're borrowing a word that is, in this case, that is utilized from divine inspiration.
I was asking from Vladimir Sizik, and also as one other person as well asked if you can make the PowerPoint available.
I can. What I can do, I have to be. I can give it to you, John, and if you do have a place that you put it up.
Yeah, people can email me, and I'll send it to them.
Let's just have PowerPoint available to you.
People can find my email address at my website. Otherwise, I'll put it in the chat right here for people.
David is asking, "Are you coming to Canada? You need to invite me, and I'll come." I was just there in October, but invite me, and certainly I would love to come and help out you out in Canada.
Awesome.
And the PowerPoint here, this from G2, well, that one's already been answered. You'll have that.
Yeah.
Is there a hadith or something saying who was the first Muslim to write down any part of the Quran? Well, that's the one that we just put up. And that's the volume 6, hadith number 509 and 510. And I think that one, if you just go up there, that's the classic one that everybody uses. That's why I put it forward. That's why I introduced it in this talk here. That is the one that is used by all scholars today, mainly because it's so comprehensive. And that's whenever I say the classic narrative, or when anybody says the classic narrative, that is the classic narrative. That it was first written down after Muhammad died by Abu Bakr, 632 to 634. That was then given to Umar, who then gave it to his daughter Hafsa. She retained it for 20 years, and then it was then given back to Uthman, and then he had Zayd ibn Thabit with Alas Zubair and Hisham to then rewrite it in the Qurayshi dialect. And then that was sent to 9 cities, and all the other ones that disagreed were then burnt. Again, people don't want to talk about that today. Isn't it interesting that Muslims don't want to talk about that? And it's fascinating that if you want to see, if you just unpack what al-Bukhari is saying in the late 9th century, if you just unpack those 2 hadith, 509 and 510, you can pull apart an enormous amount of what's going on here. And that's why it's important that we do go back to the hadith, because that's the earliest we have any reference to how the Quran was put together. Can you give us background? The person who has 31 Qurans, her name is Hatun Tash. If you go up on DCCI, which is her YouTube site, you can see her at the ladder, and she's at Speaker's Corner every Sunday. You can go and see her personally. Go and talk to her. I'm not permitted to talk about her because she is very private. She won't tell you much about herself. And that's why, since she won't tell you about herself, I'm not permitted to tell you about her. But she is a real inspiration to me. She's a colleague of mine, and I feel privileged to have her on my team. And it's been great to the work that she is doing. But you can go see her, go talk to her, and engage with her, and also try to take her on there at Speaker's Corner in London every Sunday afternoon. Then you have Arkan. Is there a 3-minute in the end? I would love to share something with Jay. Okay, we can come back to him. Ijaz asks, Quran 47 includes diacritics, and it is dated to the 7th century. Do you deny that it is diacritical existed at that point in time? The fact that there are diacritics now suggests that they were put in at a later date, so I would deny it, yes. Michael Cook in 2004 argues that the Quran has been preserved through dual cities transmitting the same text at the same time. He looks at 6th transmission within the 7th century via the science of stemmatics. And I would question whether Michael Cook is correct on that, whether it is from the 7th century. I'll always keep questioning that, as we've already discussed with him. The evidence they provide when confronted with the accounts transmitted by the Islamic traditions about the writing down of the Quran confirms that these reports contain, without doubt, a historical core. And notably, in the case of the Codex Peripheral, that a text compatible with the canonical version was transmitted. Do you disagree with him? No, I don't disagree with Gross, and I've talked to him personally about this, and he was very clear privately with me that he didn't believe any of these were from the 7th century. He said very clearly these were 8th century, and that's why by the 8th century, the Quran is starting to be put together. But that's why you have, with Dan Brubaker's, but you have so many of the corrections going on, and these corrections continue up until the 9th century. And it's the fact that these corrections, these additions, these erasings, these coverings, these tapings, almost 4,000 of them that we have now been able to put together, continue right up until the 9th century, prove the fact that there is no one Quran that was complete or unchanged, or from the 7th century. And that's what we started out with this whole talk with, and we end with that. So it's a good place to end on. Thanks so much. It's been a good time to be with you all.
Mm-hmm. Should we ask Arkan what he wanted to share, or shall we just wind up there?
Why don't we end it down here and then keep me on, and I can talk to Arkan face to face.
Okay, awesome. I'll make you a host if you like, because I'm going to leave. And then if you want to promote anyone to panelist, you're welcome to do so. So you can talk to Arkan. Give me a sec here.
I'll stop the recording now. This will be a good time for us to then bring it to a conclusion. But remember, isn't it interesting? We've ended with what we started with, John. Mm-hmm. We started with the idea that we are trying to see if this is a man-made text. We're not trying to. The Muslims believe it is from God. It is eternal. It has divine authority. What we try to do today by looking at those 5 areas to show that in every case men had some intervention, men had some control, mankind or men had some authority over it. And by showing that both with the 2 compilations, with the 6 manuscripts, looking at the Sana, upper and lower layers, looking at even with the radiocarbon dating, as much as that is inconclusive, and then finally ending with the Qurans that we have today, the 31 different ones we have today. In every case, there was intervention, intentional, look at that word, intentional intervention by man, proving that this is a man-made book that has nothing to do with God. That's my opinion. It's nothing to do with God, but it does not come from heaven, and it does not come from any eternal tablets. And I hope for those who are listening, that this is something you can walk away from and you can be at least convinced by. This is Jay here in the United States. God bless you. It's been good to have this time with you, and we'll end our recording there. God bless you. Goodbye.
All right.